Hi, welcome back, guys. This is your friend, the Momo Fanfics, back with the amazing fanfiction. This is series of What If Bakugo Had a Little Fluffy Friend? The sky had been gray for 2 days. Kaminari couldn't feel any extra electricity in the air, so the possibility of a lightning storm had at least been ruled out. Everyone had collectively given up expecting the rain to hit by the third day. So it was just his luck, wasn't it? Bakugo pushed through the first set of gym doors, pausing in the small interim room to glare at the downpour that greeted him beyond the final pair of doors. The rain came in sleets. He growled deep in his throat and pulled his zip-up hoodie's drawstrings taut. Rain meant a temperature drop more often than not, and he had just showered. He considered his options only for a moment before H tore his hoodie back to rake his hands through his hair. He flexed his tendons, sending small explosions through the strands. It stood, spiked and styled, and most importantly dry. He'd be damned if he was going to get sick just because his hair was still wet. Readjusting his hood, he slipped his phone into his duffel bag and zipped it tight. His phone had a better chance of surviving the short walk back to the dorms if it were sandwiched between his gym clothes. He hefted the duffel bag over his shoulders with a huff and pushed through the doors. His back and shoulders were drenched within moments. He'd have preferred to wait it out, but he couldn't tell just how long that would have been. It was better that he return to the dorms, take a secondary hot shower, and take whatever precautions he could to prevent himself from getting sick. He was doing spectacular with not getting sick so far, and he was not getting sick because of some rain. He'd sooner go down for days due to food poisoning, or perhaps malaria. He tried to focus on the hot shower that was waiting for him when he got back, and not the drenched hoodie over his shoulders. He could see the dorm building in his sights through the sleets of rain when he heard a small sound through the rain. Bakugo slowed his walk, straining his ears, his nerves catching fire. The sound came again, moments later, from a cluster of bushes along the path. Bakugo pushed the many ideas sprouting in his head away. Most of them were ridiculous scenarios anyway. It wasn't logical to suspect every single noise that seemed out of place was a villain waiting and hiding. Mr. Compress was the only villain in the League of Assholes that they knew of who could shrink to the size required to hide in the bushes, and even if it was him, he couldn't make noise or attack as effectively as he'd need to when he was compressed. The fact the marbles didn't emit sound meant Bakugo could at least rule that flashy asshole out. He didn't see any wisps of shadows, either, ruling out Kurogiri. 2 for 2 of the most troublesome villains used for kidnapping transport, at least. He felt it safe to say that whatever was in the bush wasn't any villain, and so let himself relax a little further. Even if the League, the Villain Alliance, whatever the hell they were calling themselves, now managed to get onto campus, he doubted they'd do it in a torrential downpour, or even get this far to begin with. The noise came a third time, and he could finally pinpoint it. It was tiny, weak mewling. Bakugo stalked over to the bushes, kneeling down and pushing branches aside, to look at the ground. Curled up in the dirt and dead leaves was a small kitten. It couldn't have been more than a month or so old and was tiny. Bakugo scoffed, moving to stand, when the kitten mewed again. The sound was so thoroughly pathetic that Bakugo halted. The rain was slipping through the leaves and leaving the kitten soaking wet. He battled with himself for a minute, weighing the pros and cons of Aizawa's wrath, before he determined the cons list was only marginally longer than the pros. Regardless, Bakugo reached forward into the bushes. The kitten's instinct was to bite and scratch, but it hadn't even broken skin. It was a valiant effort, but it was futile, and soon the kitten was set in Bakugo's grip. He was mildly confused when the kitten didn't even bother to elicit a hiss as he unzipped his jacket and bundled the small furball inside. He was, on no uncertain terms, letting the filthy thing in the same bag as his phone and wallet. He zipped the hoodie back up, cradling the small form in his hand so it didn't slip down, and started over to the dorms again. The kitten shivered against his chest, but he could feel it getting warmer already. The kitten seemed to figure that out as well, because it wriggled closer to him. He was ducking under the dorm entryway in minutes. He grit his teeth against his own shivering, having been thoroughly drenched now, and wanted nothing more than to blast the front door down. He turned the knob and sighed in relief when it gave way. He was grateful that the kitten hadn't had the stupid idea to try and jump out of his hoodie to sprint away when they'd stopped. If it had been that gun-ho in leaving him behind, he'd have let it. Once through the doorway, he shook himself out a bit, throwing back the hood and forcing his shoes off. He dropped the duffel bag in the entryway, resolving to grab his phone later. The common room wasn't that full. He could hear some of his classmates in the kitchen and dining rooms, likely accounting for most, if not all, of the class, as it was nearing dinner, and they had a tendency to migrate downstairs when the time neared. One or two were likely up in their rooms still. This did, however, complicate things. He had only just managed to step out of the entryway when a loud meow sounded off. The entire common room fell silent. Heads swiveled around to find the source. No one seemed to think his sudden freezing was suspicious. He could break for the stairs and tell anyone who questioned him to foo. Kuda came barreling down the staircase looking frantic. Bakugo watched him, mentally noting that the boy would have just run him over if he'd tried to go up the stairs at the time. Another meow and all eyes swiveled towards him. Bakugo knew when to call something quits despite what the family motto might imply, and he sighed. The rain had already reddened his cheeks, thankfully, masking his flushed face. Kuda's head snapped towards him like a predator zeroing in on their prey. He had never felt more fear for the boy than he did in that instant. But it only lasted an instant. Bakugo reluctantly, but carefully, unzipped his jacket and removed the kitten. The chaos was immediate. Most of the class present was left gaping at the kitten. Some he heard squeal. Ashido literally leapt over the couch and its occupants. Kuda moved faster than Bakugo had ever seen before to block her rapid approach, and the girl collided head-on into him. Both fell to the floor in a tangle of limbs. Bakugo stepped over them. "Wait, let me pet it," Ashido pleaded. Bakugo sidestepped her grabby hands at his ankles. "Fuck off, you're scaring it," he snapped. His claim didn't do a damn thing to deter her or any of the others from approaching him, but it had at least calmed them down. Regardless, they flanked him and soon others joined until he had most of the class surrounding him. The kitten itself was meowing with some fierce attitude. It made its break for freedom, finally, and Bakugo's hands shot out to catch it. Now that it was free of his jacket entirely and only held by his palms, Bakugo froze. The kitten readjusted, clambering over itself to steady in his grip. He didn't hear anything his classmates were saying as they fawned over it, questioned him and his health and sanity for bringing it back, and pushed each other around to see. He was tuning them all out because all he could think was don't flex the tendons. Kuda squeezed his way to the front, whispering to the kitten. Bakugo wasn't sure what the other was saying, but it got the kitten to stop squirming around considerably. Eventually, Kuda straightened up. Yayurazu and Ida were wrangling their classmates back to give the two some much-needed breathing room. Midoriya sidled up next to Kuda as he started to sign. "He says it doesn't want to leave," Midoriya started, stopping when Bakugo cut in harshly, his voice strained. "It doesn't want to leave the scary blonde. I'm warm. I got it, nerd." "Wait, you understand sign?" Midoriya asked. "Since when?" Bakugo shot him a venomous glare, looking ready to burst, and Midoriya fell silent. His eyes trailed to Bakugo's hands. The kitten had curled up, and it was napping right in Bakugo's palms. The room had fallen relatively quiet, and Midoriya's gaze lifted slowly back up to meet Bakugo's. He was panicking. His face wasn't all that different from his typical scowling, but Midoriya had spent most of his life learning how to read Bakugo's face, and he could see the differences, such as the extra strain hidden in the eyes. There was a tenseness in his hands. Beads of sweat were being masked by droplets of rain. Midoriya took pity on him, slowly lifting the kitten from his hands. The kitten woke up only partially to give an indignant mewl. Bakugo deflated instantly. He stopped before flexing for a full blast. He eyed the kitten and turned away just slightly, holding his hands out in front of him and letting off a stream of small ignitions, like tiny firecrackers. His gaze drifted over to the sleeping kitten, brow furrowing, and he bit back an undignified whine. He turned on his heel. Bakubro. Kirishima met him at the front door once Bakugo shoved past Midoriya and Kuda. Dude? Bakugo swung the front door open. He clapped his hands, a brilliant explosion ringing out the front of the building towards the sky. The windows rattled in their frames. Midoriya yelped as the kitten bolted awake, climbing its way down his arm and over his shoulder. Kuda caught it before it could hit the ground, whispering soothingly in its ear. Bakugo, oblivious, gave a relieved shout that petered out into a sigh. He kicked the door shut behind him and tore the rest of his hoodie off. Bakugo cut Kirishima short, shoving past him this time, and towards the stairs. He was at the base of the stairs when the kitten started to wail. He turned towards it and Kuda. Kuda looked at him guiltily. What? Bakugo asked. I think it wants you, Asui says from the common room. Hell no, Bakugo shouts immediately, before he can even fully process what she'd said, and then turned to the common room. I'm not some damn space heater. Give it to Isahot. Todoroki's eyes lit up at the prospect. He stepped forward with his hand held up. The kitten watched him warily. It tried to make itself even smaller, backing into Kuda's chest. Todoroki stopped short. He left his hand raised, heating up the air around them. The kitten gave an odd-sounding meow, looking between Todoroki and Bakugo, before its next meow turned into a yowl. It tried to scramble out of Kuda's grip to get to Bakugo. Wow, it's got a set of pipes, Jiru cheered. Kuda set the kitten on the ground, and it hobbled over to Bakugo as fast as its little legs could carry it. Ah, Bakumum. The fuck did you just for fuck's sake, Bakugo groaned. He was left staring at the skittering set of tail and limbs coming towards him. The damn thing couldn't even walk on the wooden floor properly yet. Language. Can it? 4 eyes. Kaken, I think it. Midoriya paused. The kitten had reached Bakugo's feet now, clambering onto his wet socks. Midoriya quickly signed his next words, ignoring the calls and shouts of no fair and questions. Imprinted. It imprinted. Bakugo stared at him, his eyes growing just a little wider, for a long moment. The kitten pawed at his calf. He was pretty sure he saw Uraraka snapping pictures. He broke from his stupor long enough to snatch the kitten up and storm upstairs. He was not addressing that theory if he could help it. He didn't care if the kitten whined when he set it on the bathroom sink. It looked down, shuffling along the edge, before it apparently decided the jump was too risky. Instead, it started to wail as it paced back and forth. Bakugo got the water in the shower warm, minding that it wasn't too hot, before stripping. He cradled the kitten against his chest and sat on the shower floor, pulling the curtain shut, and reached for the small hand towel. He knew they had no pet shampoo, or at least none for cats. He wasn't sure if human shampoo would work. Kuda would have known. Hell, Ojiru might have even known. But he was not about to go back downstairs mid-shower to ask either of them. Bakugo settled for cradling the kitten and stepping out to search each shower in turn until he'd found Ojiru's special shampoo he used to wash his tail fur. Slipping back into sitting in his own shower and reveling in the warm water, he started to lather up the small gray kitten. He was mindful of the eyes and mouth especially. The kitten put up a little bit of a fuss, but it couldn't wriggle free of his grip, despite getting close a few times. Bakugo started to rinse next. He was surprised when the gray started to wash out to reveal a white kitten instead. He double-checked the shampoo. No bleaching agents. He huffed and let the kitten down. It wasted no time curling up against the outside of his thigh after failing to successfully wobble around. He was just going to have to shower like this, he supposed. The common room was chaotic when he returned. He was disappointed to find this out. He changed into his pajama sweats in anticipation that he could just lounge on the couch. But no, the universe had other plans. Because the entire class had apparently decided to set up something called the kitty corner in the common room. It had a banner. There was an entire cat tree. Bakugo blinked at the spectacle. Takoyami and Jiru were acting as an assembly line of food to Yaoyorozu as she started making a pile of cat toys. Midoriya was holding up her phone, probably so she could see the ingredients for each toy. Kuda was nearby setting out food and water dishes. The two bowls were customized. Yaoyorozu had added beveled paws prints. She had taken her new profession as creative cat spoiler very seriously, apparently. Ida was with the half of the class who was left, frantically researching cat care. They had encircled the coffee table. Notes were strewn across the surface. Bakugo stepped forward, clearing his throat to garner attention. The fuck is even happening right now? We're making a space for Ashes, Ashido says. For Gray Sun, Kaminari says. Ashido shot him a look. Fight me. Who the hell is Ashes? Who the fuck is Grayson? Bakugo asks, shoving the two apart. The looks of confusion he got had him worried. He'd actually forgotten someone's name for a second. The kitten, Kiro. Oh, for fucks. What? Those names are stupid. A pun, Sparkplug. Seriously. And what of it? Kaminari asked. I still say Bakugo should name it. He found it. Todoroki piped up. You seriously want it called something by him? He calls you Isahat. He has good nicknaming skills, Todoroki says, completely straight-faced. And I still assert that the name Ashes slaps, Ashido says. No, it fucking doesn't. Any name you all pick will suck. Anyway, Bakugo says confidently. You've only heard two of them. If they're based on color, you're wrong. Why? Todoroki asks, turning away from the cat study group to turn to him. Bakugo stared, poker-faced himself, as he reached into the new hoodie's front pouch and brought out the sleepy white furball. The squeals could have replaced dog whistles. Snowflake. Hell no, we're not basing it on color. Kaminari yawned hard and stretched. He plopped down the stairs, only half caring if anyone heard him. It was almost 2 a.m. at this point, so he wasn't worried about waking anyone. He almost tripped when he hit the bottom of the stairs and saw Aizawa standing in the common room. The man was facing the couch. Aizawa-sensei. Aizawa spared him a glance before turning his attention back to the couch. Kaminari froze, his eyes drifting towards Kitten Corner and the litany of obvious cat supplies that he couldn't lie himself out of explaining. He didn't even get an attempt to, however, as he noticed why Aizawa was staring at the couch instead of Kitten Corner. Kaminari stood straighter, craning his neck to see over the couch's back. Bakugo was laid out on the couch, his body rigid, and red eyes locked onto him. Kaminari gaped. The kitten was sprawled over Bakugo's neck and collarbone. Its paws were pressed against his pulse point. The kitten looked utterly out to the rest of the world, but Bakugo looked like he'd been strung tight. He was in internal peril. One wrong move and the claws would dig right into his skin. In his peripheral, Kaminari caught Aizawa slowly raising his phone out of his pocket. Kaminari watched, debating if this were a dream, as the teacher snapped a photo. The audible click of the camera sending Bakugo into a very rigid quiver of rage. Kaminari pulled his own phone out, doing the same. He deftly ignored the glare, promising a painful death. The kitten stretched. Kaminari had never seen Bakugo look so conflicted before in his life. The kitten was wailing in the morning and Uraraka wasn't sure why. She, along with everyone else, was unsure exactly where it had slept last night. All she knew was that Takoyami looked very upset, and Kuda looked very tired. Yaoyorozu was sitting amongst a pile of failed attempts of bags of what looked like gray sand and gum to Uraraka. She readjusted her arms, currently holding the screaming and squirming kitten, as Takoyami glared at the loud baby. She was shocked that the kitten hadn't tried to pounce him, yet. She thought perhaps that's why he looked so mad. If only. No, Takoyami was mad because he had the unfortunate luck of stepping in the cat's mess. And Kuda had then been promptly dragged from bed to communicate with the kitten, which was starving, and was making sure everyone knew it. Yayurazu was similarly dragged from bed to try and make both cat food and litter. Uraraka had come down to find the three trying to wrangle the kitten and quiet it down. But given Uraraka had heard it all the way on the 4th floor, she doubted they'd ever have gotten very far. More of the class was coming down the stairs at the yowling. She tried to shush the kitten with what she hoped was reassuring cooing. That was dashed when Bakugo came stomping down between Kaminari, who was looking like he was running for his life, and Kirishima, who had linked their arms and was trying to drag Bakugo away from Kaminari the second their feet hit the floor. Another well-timed wail and Bakugo's head snapped to see Uraraka holding the kitten. "The fuck is its problem?" he asked. The kitten spotted him. Instead of wailing his greeting, it meowed pathetically. "The fuck is its problem? We need to go shopping for it," Yayurazu finally admitted. She was defeated, giving up trying to craft actual cat litter and cat food. She was just too tired to focus properly, and with the screaming kitten, she felt she wasn't going to be able to focus at all anyway. Todoroki trudged to the fridge, grabbed a piece of chicken out of an old food container, and promptly cooked it right in his palm. Uraraka just stared at him as he came up to her, tearing pieces of chicken off to feed to the kitten. Kuda seemed to appear rather grateful, signing his thanks, as Todoroki was enraptured with feeding the kitten, pushing the thought of what that chicken must taste like with a quirk cooking it first. Uraraka set the kitten down onto the island counter. Todoroki followed rather hilariously like a hypnotized puppy. Others of the class started to get their own meals ready for the start of the day that they were forced to start this early. Midoriya opted to avoid the kitchen entirely after grabbing himself some cereal and a bowl once he caught Bakugo glancing in that direction, as the kitten seemed to be subdued for now. "And take it to a vet," Asui says. She leaned over the edge of the counter, watching the kitten chew on the chicken. She stuck her tongue out, and the kitten eyed it. She quickly sucked it back in, standing straight again. "After all, it is a stray." Bakugo laughed darkly. He sauntered up to the small gathering, leaning on the counter. "And who the hell is paying for all that, huh?" Todoroki suddenly straightened, a look of determination painting his face. He reached in his back pocket to pull out and slam a credit card onto the counter. The kitten jumped and meowed indignantly at him, slinking backward towards Bakugo. Bakugo stared at the card, then up at Todoroki, only to be met with Todoroki staring at him with the most determined look in his eyes since the sports festival. "It's Endeavor's money," he says proudly. Yayurazu shyly slid her card back into her wallet. Bakugo stared at Todoroki for a very long time before he slid the card off the table and into his own back pocket. "Whipped," he whispered, sauntering off towards the front door. "Wait, you need Aizawa-sensei's permission," Uraraka called after him. Bakugo stopped at the front door and groaned. "Do I really fucking have to? It's down the damn road." "Not the vet," Asui says plainly. She turned to him, once again kneeling at the kitchen island. The cat started to play with her hair. "You need a chaperone or Aizawa-sensei himself for any trip, too," Bakugo growled, kicking his shoes back off and stomping for the stairs. "If I die because I had to wake him up, I'm killing you all." Takoyami finally tore his eyes off the kitten to stare up the stairs after Bakugo. "An impressive feat if he's dead." Midoriya choked on his cereal. Aizawa was still half asleep when Bakugo started to pound on the apartment door. He knew it was a matter of time before someone came to rouse him, not that they would have needed to try, because the cat had done most of the work for them. But he'd been praying it was anyone but one of two students. Problem child Midoriya and Bakugo. Not his luck today, apparently. Aizawa dragged himself out of bed and trudged towards the door. He was already sighing when he opened it. Yes? We need to get some fucking litter and cat food. Can I go? Bakugo asked. Aizawa rubbed at his eye and took a steadying breath. God, he needed coffee. I'll be down in 10. He shut the door before Bakugo could attempt to try and negotiate that. He could hear him stomping back downstairs with a string of curses following him. He was actually down in about 6 minutes. And by the time he'd arrived, Yayurazu was angrily glaring holes in the trash can, whilst she dumped failed litter attempt after failed litter attempt into it after a quick inspection. Jiru and Satu were shoveling food to her as she did. He then turned to see Bakugo at the kitchen island already looking impatient. Kirishima was trying his best to ease the tension from the other's shoulders, even going so far as to try and coo at him lovingly. But Bakugo was too pissed for it to work very well. Aizawa opted to ignore the cooing entirely if he was going to have any chance of avoiding probing questions about it later. All right, let's go, Aizawa announced. Bakugo wasted no time getting to the front door. Aizawa was halfway there when the kitten finally noticed Bakugo's form slinking away, and it wailed. Aizawa squeezed his eyes shut at the shocking volume. Don't tell me you're the one who found it, Aizawa sighed. Bakugo was silent. Why did you keep it? It was pouring rain. Thing looks like a string bean on a good day, Bakugo says. Aizawa could only nod. He had to admit, it looked like it would be. Bakugo had intended to break Kaminari's phone when he'd gotten up that morning, not go shopping for cat litter and cat food. In fact, he'd felt the resolve grow tenfold when he looked at his phone and found the group chat had exploded just an hour before. Shocking, given half the class tried to sleep in. And then he saw the photo Kaminari had shared. Him, on the couch, with a kitten obliviously stretched at his neck. He'd made it as far as Kaminari's door before Kirishima had tackled him. So, since he couldn't destroy the phone just yet, he settled on finding a decent brand of litter and food. He'd not expected Aizawa to help speed up the process. This one is best for its age, the older man had said, dropping a specific brand of food into the cart. At least until it's a year old. Then we can wean it off and onto a more adult food brand. Bakugo stared at the bag as Aizawa then turned sharply in the aisle to peruse the litter selection. He dumped 2 of the same brand into the cart next. Bakugo found himself being pulled along with the cart as Aizawa dragged it behind him. He wasn't sure how Aizawa knew so much about cats. But then again, he had never been to the man's old apartment before the dorms were constructed. So as far as he knew, Aizawa had a whole fleet of cats at his place. Once done, Bakugo didn't feel a hint of remorse for swiping Todoroki's card. He'd been rather enthusiastic to offer it up. After all, even after the two had decided to spontaneously grab some groceries. They'd returned to the dorms expecting something of a mess. A mess being the chaos that often enveloped class stubbornly. Neither were surprised to see that the kitten had the whole class wrapped around its paw in the hour they'd been gone. Ashido was completely enraptured, cooing and petting the kitten fondly. Takoyami seemed to have forgiven the mishap of the morning because he was sat beside her, letting the kitten paw at his beak of all things. Most of the class was taking photos on their phones with Kuda conducting them on how to act, how far to be, and how quiet to be, so as not to frighten the kitten. Bakugo stared, a little dumbfounded. Aizawa just stared. Eventually, Aizawa was first to move, depositing the litter and kitten food beside the counter for the students to deal with. He disappeared back to the stairs. Bakugo unloaded the groceries while he had the time to do so without a wailing cat at his ankles. He stopped abruptly once he heard Ashido call it Snowflake. Oh hell no. We're not fucking calling it Snowflake, Bakugo screamed, slamming the door to the fridge shut. Why not? Ashido asked, sounding genuinely hurt. She started up her crocodile tears. Bakubabe. No, Bakugo stressed. He wasn't falling for her crocodile tears. She could shove those tears up her ass for all he cared. The name of the kitten was not going to be Snowflake. The day I concede to calling that thing something as pansy as Snowflake is the day I've officially died. Okay, harsh. Fuck you kindly, we're not calling it that, Bakugo said with finality. Ashido pouted at him, slumping over the couch. The kitten was set on the coffee table, and currently was crawling over Takoyami's head to get a better look at Bakugo. Takoyami sat up slowly, letting the kitten rise over the top of the couch comically slow, until it caught sight of him and mewed. Hagakure snorted. Bakugo felt his eyebrow twitch. Pick a different name. How come you get to decide the name? Kaminari asked. Because I found the fucking thing. So, what, asshole? You want to fight about it? Bakugo screeched. The kitten mewed again. Ashido picked it up gingerly, giving a squeal, and set it on the floor. It waddled around the couch slowly on its march towards Bakugo. Bakugo stomped around the counter space, scooping it up onto his shoulder so he could storm over to the class proper. And while you're at it, give me your fucking phone. No, I still have payments on it, Kaminari screeched, diving through the class to the very back, as far from Bakugo's rage as possible. He dove behind Midoriya specifically, the tank that the boy was, for protection given it was that or Kirishima. And Kirishima was too close to Bakugo. Should have thought of that before. Pikachu, Bakugo shouted. Kirishima stood in his way, taking advantage of blocking his path to wrap the boy in a hug. Come on, Bakubro, calm down. We won't call it Snowflake. But what else do you want to call it? Kirishima asks. I haven't even bothered to think about it, Bakugo admitted. Why the fuck should I? Well, you clearly feel very strongly about it, Todoroki deadpan. Bakugo turned his glare on him. It was slightly hampered by the fact the kitten was potatoed on his shoulder now that he wasn't moving. We could all suggest names and take a class vote, Yaoyorozu suggested. I get veto rights, Bakugo snaps immediately. He pushed Kirishima away, shooting a glare to the class at large. Fight me on it. No thanks. I'm okay with that, Asui says first. She turned her attention away from her phone to Bakugo. You rescued it, so you should be able to veto the name. But if you suggest one, it's a class vote all the same. Sound fair? Bakugo tapped his foot for a moment. After a few tense moments, he shrugged. Yeah, fine. Anyone else want to chime in? No one going to fight that. A few glances were shared, but otherwise everyone was silent. Ida clapped his hands, then chopped the air with a finality. It's decided then. We will determine the name based on a voting system, wherein Bakugo has veto rights. But we can veto his suggestions with majority vote. Understood? Yes. Great, now fuck off. I'm making myself something to eat, Bakugo said, waltzing into the kitchen, kitten still perched on his shoulder. Suggestions were being thrown out immediately once Bakugo had gone to make his lunch. The voices shouting suggestions filtering into the kitchen. Icy. Snow. No, snowy. Blizzard. Flurry. Knock it off with the fucking winter theme, Bakugo screamed. He slammed his hand on the counter. Any of you that suggested a fucking winter name, it's immediately vetoed. Aw, come on, that's not fair. Fuck off, you already took the deal, Bakugo screamed back. He was plating the rice and pork by the time Aizawa had come back down from his apartment and started to take in the names being thrown out in the common room. Ruin, Takoyami suggested, entirely too seriously, and Bakugo scoffed from the kitchen. Hell no, bird brain, try again. Takoyami deflated, grumbling into the couch. Aizawa turned away from them, some of them still throwing out wintry names regardless, and being gently shot down by the majority vote, and towards the kitchen. He stopped at the counter, where Bakugo was leaning and eating his lunch. Aizawa had his phone out, typing onto it. I'm headed to the school for a few hours, he says. Bakugo nodded, still stuffing his mouth. Aizawa finally looked up, spotting the kitten, and stared. Got something to say? Bakugo asks. Keep doing that, and it'll do it, even when it's full grown, Aizawa says plainly. Bakugo watched him turn away, brow raised. That was an interesting prospect, actually. He'd have to remember that. You'll need a name to take it to the vet. Oh, right. Vets required pets' names. Oh, Aizawa-sensei, Ashido called. Aizawa paused at the door, turning to them all. You should throw out a name for the kitten. What? It'd be fair that you can suggest names as well, Ida explained. We're brainstorming. You're all crashing and burning, Bakugo quipped. I'll suggest one name, but not right now, Aizawa says. I'll be back later. Don't burn the dorm down. Why am I here? Yayurazu asks idly. Todoroki shrugged and Bakugo readjusted the kitten in his grip. He should have bought a carrier crate when he'd gone shopping with Aizawa. Another thing to buy with Todoroki's card, then. Because you're going to keep me from killing Isahat before this is done. And Aizawa-sensei said we had to at least bring you or Ida if we were taking this spec to the vet, Bakugo says. We don't have a name for it, Yayurazu says. Bakugo clicked his tongue at her. Yayurazu held the door open for the two. Bakugo went in first, walking right past the front desk. Yayurazu and Todoroki approached the front desk. Yayurazu with a kind wave and Todoroki with a small bow of his head. Good morning. What can we do for you today? One of the receptionists asks. We need to get a checkup for a kitten, Yayurazu says. We're not sure about how old it is, or if it needs anything. Oh, that's no problem. Jada, thank you. The receptionist grabbed the small stack of paperwork from the younger of the two. The younger woman turned her attention back to Bakugo after she'd handed off the paperwork. She rested her chin in her hands and was trying not to laugh as she watched the kitten trying to climb onto Bakugo's head. Yayurazu handed the paperwork off to Todoroki. She glanced Bakugo's way briefly, catching sight of the kitten as it had made its way onto his shoulder, and the boy looked very conflicted on whether or not to tear it off, and she couldn't help but smile. He really didn't show his softer sides enough, in her opinion. Todoroki was filling out the paperwork rather fast. Whilst Yayurazu relayed where they'd actually found the kitten, he actually found it in the rain and brought it back to the dorm. But he paused at the bottom. A name. Right, they needed a name. Oh, that's why I recognize you three. Todoroki glanced up, the youngest of the two's eyes shining. She pointed to each of them in turn. You're UA students, Shouto, Creati, and Lord Explosion Murder. Lord what? The other woman asked quietly. Bakugo snorted, shifting the kitten to his other shoulder. You know, from the sports festival. Oh, you won that. The older woman shouted, pointing to Bakugo. Damn straight. Katsuki, Yayurazu said warningly. Bakugo tusked at her, turning his attention back to the kitten, which was trying to jump onto his mop of hair and failing miserably. It protested heavily as he settled it back in his lap. Oh goodness. The kitten was trying to climb his arms immediately. Todoroki slid the paper back to the receptionist, stone-faced, even as she looked at the name for the small white fluff ball, and then looked back up with mirth. Just cat? She asks. We haven't chosen a name yet, Yayurazu explained with a giggle. We can change it later, right? Oh, of course. We can update the digital record anytime, the receptionist said, waving it off. The vet will give her a quick checkup, and will calculate cost once he's done, all right? Yes, that's perfect, thank you, Yayurazu says, bowing to them. She hooked her arm into Todoroki's and dragged him towards Bakugo in the seating area. Each took a seat next to him. The kitten drifted towards Todoroki, curling up on his right thigh. Yayurazu snickered at the barely perceptible indecision that crossed Todoroki's face once the kitten settled its head. Isahat, you look like you're about to combust. What the fuck is the matter with you? Bakugo asks. Is it going to move if I pet it? Bakugo stared at him a second. He crossed his arms, sizing Todoroki up a moment. What the hell do you think? Yaoyorozu sighed. If you try to pick a fight, Katsuki, Aizawa may not let us keep the kitten. Shockingly enough, that seemed to get Bakugo to step back. She'd have to remember that for later. Thankfully, the actual vet visit wasn't that eventful. Bakugo had opted to stay back in the lobby, rather than trying to squeeze into the exam room with Yaoyorozu and Todoroki. The kitten had made it rather obvious that it didn't agree with that arrangement. But Todoroki, holding it in his right arm, quickly quieted it from yowling to small mews. The exam took longer than either had expected, and Yaoyorozu had half expected to find a portion of the lobby blown up when they'd returned, and was pleasantly surprised when that wasn't the case. She held the kitten up, in an average-sized carrier that looked obnoxiously large with such a small occupant, like some sort of prize she was presenting. Todoroki slipped by her to pay, ignoring the display entirely. Bakugo had no such mercy, having to look Yaoyorozu in the eye, as she absolutely glistened with excitement. Bakugo got out of his seat, taking the carrier so the kitten would stop crying, and nudged her arm. She beamed at him, lacing her hand in his free one on their way back to the dorm. Bakugo had went about the rest of his day with little other hindrance aside from a kitten following him every time he entered the common room. And, if asked about the naming conventions of his class, Bakugo would say they landed squarely in the "they don't know what the fuck they're doing" category. They landed in that category a lot, but that was beside the point. None of them knew how to pick a good name for a pet. And that is exactly what the kitten had become. It was the class pet, and had been the moment Bakugo came down from the shower and revealed the fluffy wonder in all its glory. Luckily, most of the names he didn't even have to veto, as the class did that for him through the majority voting. Over the course of the next few days, the class fell into a sort of pattern. Even if they were in the midst of doing something, names would be called out. How about Ghost? Hagakure suggested over dinner that first night. It had almost been chosen, but Bakugo had vetoed it once the vote had been taken, leaving Hagakure to slump in her chair. He had been close to accepting until he had the revelation that he'd be shouting "Ghost" throughout the dorms if he ever had to find the tiny thing. Tiny, tiny thing. As it would turn out, that was her only suggestion. Aizawa had come back from the school after dinner and dropped papers onto the coffee table, right next to the kitten who Yaoyorozu was still testing toys on. It pounced on the papers immediately. When they, obviously, didn't react, it went back to the toy. The class at large had looked to Aizawa curiously. Once you get a name, just write it on the first page, he'd said. What are these? Uraraka asked, picking them up to review. Her head shot up to Aizawa, a glimmer of joy in her eyes. This is paperwork for a class pet. You'll be filling in a budget estimate for it, Aizawa says. That way you won't be wasting money on expenses we can consolidate in the normal shopping trips. How did you even swing that? Shiro asks. Not that we aren't grateful. Clearly it's a therapy cat, Aizawa deadpanned, gesturing to where Bakugo was sat with the kitten trying to crawl into his lap, now that it had lost interest in the toys, ready for a nap. Ashido was beside him, slowly slipping off the couch with a squeal. Bakugo had shot him a glare. Next in the name game was Kaminari, taking too much liberty with the challenge and feeling too much of a high for having successfully averted death the previous day, suggesting Olaf. Bakugo decided to veto the name with a scream of, "It's a fucking girl, you idiot," and a blast right into Kaminari's face. He had taken the time to bandage him up, and a quick kiss to the temple, afterward to avoid a trip to Recovery Girl. And then the blonde had suggested Ola instead, and promptly gotten smacked upside the head. Bakugo did not give him an apology kiss for that one, no matter how much Kaminari had begged or groveled. Dolly, Jiru suggested over homework. It was immediately outvoted. Princess, Yaoyorozu had tentatively suggested during lunch one afternoon. While it had won the majority vote with the class with many coos about how it fit, Bakugo had looked at her hopeful face and inwardly sighed. He set a hand on her shoulder, surprisingly gentle, and she knew her suggestion's fate already. No. She'd taken the rejection like a champ. Uraraka had not taken her own suggestion's rejection nearly as well when she'd offered it the next day. "What's wrong with Crest?" Uraraka asked. She was already rolling up her sleeves. "I'm prepared to fight for this one. It's not fucking toothpaste. It's funny." With the power of Crest, Ashido had screamed at the top of her lungs, fist pump included, for the 5th time. Bakugo rounded on the 2, sparks flying off his palms. That's why. Needless to say, the class outvoted her suggestion, much to her and Ashido's disappointment. It was later that same day, once they were back from class, and all were exhausted, that Ashido tried her hand. Bakugo had to hand it to her. The girl was clever when it suited her best. In her mind, if her suggestion hadn't been so bad, the class might have voted more in her favor purely out of their exhaustion. First, it was Elsa. Then Bianca. Then Snow White, and Bakugo finally threatened to leave her without any semblance of affection for a week if she kept up the theme. She had conceded. "Powder?" Asui suggested one day during homeroom. Aizawa sighed, bowing his head. They still hadn't managed a name, and soon the cat would be old enough that changing it would be a pain. If they didn't settle soon, it would only ever respond to variations of Kitty, and they were doomed from then on. "Hell no," Bakugo says immediately. "Diamond," Yaoyorozu suggests. "No." Yaoyorozu bowed her head. Uraraka and Midoriya both came to her to pat her shoulders. Kuda knocked on his desk, garnering everyone's attention, but most importantly Bakugo's. He signed one word: Swan. "Fuck no. It's a cat, not a damn bird." Kuda jerked comically and faceplanted on his desk with a sigh. "Cloud," Todoroki says. "Buttons," Kuda suddenly signs eagerly. "No to both," Bakugo says, turning back around. Aizawa was just grateful Asui had waited until their personal time to bring the naming up. "Cotton," Midoriya suggests quietly. Bakugo almost let the boy have this victory based on his tone of voice alone. But he was not that weak. The class at large agreed. Aizawa let himself believe, however briefly, that it was settled. Bakugo fought against the fuzzy feeling in his chest as he turned to Midoriya's hopeful smile. He fought it off with metaphorical teeth and claws, barely able to ground out a quiet "no," and then promptly turned back around. He couldn't look Midoriya in the eyes. Those damn puppy dog eyes. He would lose the battle if he did, and Bakugo Katsuki did not lose a fight. Didn't stop him from hearing Midoriya's little, disappointed "oh," and feel like he was just stabbed. Kirishima's knowing smirk was not helping matters. "Be strong," he told himself. "You cannot call your cat fucking Cotton, no matter how much he may have wanted to." Thankfully, unbeknownst to himself, Satu ended up saving him with his own suggestions. The distraction was greatly appreciated. "Sugar," Satu suggests. "Or flour, like the baking." "Yeah, the baking flour, we got it." "And hell no," Bakugo screamed. "Chalk," Siro screamed. Good lord, Bakugo almost conceded on that one. It would have been hilarious to hear the class screaming chalk throughout the dorms, but no. He had to use this name, too. "Oh, marshmallow," Satu said, sounding like he'd had an epiphany. The actual action that resulted in finding the cat's name was not a singular event. In fact, Bakugo would dare say that it had been a long time coming, since he brought it into the dorms, to be more precise. The kitten had been deceptively good at hiding. The sole reason that Bakugo had even been trapped on the couch in the first place, he still hadn't destroyed Kaminari's phone in retaliation, was because he couldn't find the pathetic little kitten and had given up. He'd resolved to find it in the morning. And then it had jumped, from nowhere, onto his leg. He still was not sure where it had been hiding prior to hunting him. He was just impressed it had succeeded. And it hadn't stopped there. Bakugo knew it had followed him to his room the first few nights. He knew because even though he could never find it at first, he shut his door at night, and the kitten was on his pillow and snoring into his hair by morning. Every time. The kitten woke up almost the same time he did, as well, as if it had already started to adjust its own internal clock to Bakugo's sleeping schedule. Copper eyes would flutter open, and it would squeak. Yep, he was screwed. After just a week, Bakugo came back from a run to Uraraka's surprised yelp. She'd come downstairs, cradling the kitten, and looking disheveled. "The hell happened to you?" he asked, finishing off his breakfast. Uraraka gave a breathy chuckle and set the kitten down to roam. "She tackled my ankles. Right from under my bed," Uraraka says. Bakugo wasn't that surprised. She'd tackled a few ankles from under the couch already. "I had even looked before she did it." "What?" "I was looking for my spare skirt, and I checked under my bed. I didn't even see her," Uraraka says, sounding rather impressed. Over the following weeks, the kitten had hidden under over half the dorm's beds and ambushed the owners, despite how much larger she was getting. So many more offers of a variation on Cloud, as the name was becoming more and more common the larger she got. Even when they had gotten into the habit of checking under their beds before sleeping and before leaving their rooms, somehow against all logic, despite how bright the kitten's white fur was, they never managed to see it. It heavily unsettled Takoyami specifically, despite Kuda assuring him that the kitten would not try to legitimately hunt him. And then the kitten took it a step further. Bakugo almost felt bad for Takoyami at this point, but it was also hilarious to see him jumping to the top of the fridge when the kitten pounced on an unsuspecting leg. The pouncing wasn't what had necessarily gotten worse. No, it was that it had hidden inside the couch. How they came to know this was rather comical itself. Bakugo had been lounging in one of the chairs when Jiro had walked past the couch. She'd made it halfway before she screamed and jumped, falling over the coffee table, and right after her, stopping on top of the table, was the kitten, with its tail flicking back and forth. Amidst the classmates laughing, he had heard Jiro shouting. It was in the couch. It was in the couch. And they couldn't figure out how it had done it. Bakugo was firm that there was a loose seam somewhere that it could slip into. Needless to say, everyone was pressing the cushions before they took a seat when the kitten wasn't immediately in sight. One day they couldn't find it, period. Before panic could set in, Yaoyorozu had created a new feather toy, complete with a bell, and had started to drag it around the dorm building. After getting nothing in any of the bedrooms, she had moved to the kitchen, only to be met with the same result. And then finally the common room. She was passing the front of the couch when a paw shot out to bat at the toy. From the seam running along the bottom of the couch, the paw shot out a second time, batting the toy successfully a few times. "I knew it, fuckers, pay up," Bakugo had screamed. Ashido had been the only other one, aside from Kirishima, to try and arm wrestle Bakugo out of paying up her end of the bet. It hadn't worked. The kitten had started to bond with the class by this point. It would join Takoyami on the fridge top, pouncing on unsuspecting students as they passed, which was such a marked improvement that Kuda had gone and bought special treats just for the occasion. Everyone else was annoyed beyond words that Takoyami and Kuda were encouraging said behavior. It had led to the kitten getting onto the fridge, even if he was absent from the perch. No one had the warning that they may get pounced when Takoyami wasn't joining the kitten. If nothing else, Bakugo didn't find it that much of a loss. It was good dodging practice. Until he'd gotten to the level of having a sixth sense for ambush that Aizawa seemed to have, the kitten had yet to successfully pounce the man he wasn't about to try and train the behavior out. Even when the kitten replicated the behavior in the pantry cabinets, he wasn't even sure how it got the doors open. Finally, blessedly, after a month and a half, the name game had come to an end. Bakugo was sitting with most of the class in the common room, trying to tutor his squad plus partners about advanced mathematics when it happened. Aizawa was joining them only to grade papers, but Bakugo could respect someone who just came by to crush his tutor-ease dreams with each strike of a red pen. It was a level of crushing power that he could only aspire to in his tutoring endeavors. Aizawa-sensei, do you have a name for the kitten yet, Kiro? HNG. That's right. You haven't suggested one yet? Hagakure proclaimed, pointing accusingly. Oh, is that so? Aizawa drawls, striking another mark across the page. Ashido winced from her spot next to Kirishima at the table. If you need inspiration, it's impossible to find. But the name Ghost has already been vetoed, Takoyami says from the common room. I still think Abyss would have been funnier, Midoriya muttered somewhat bitterly. Uraraka absently patted his shoulder. Shadow, Aizawa says. The room fell silent. But only for one blessed moment, before Ashido shot out of her chair. The mighty, she shouted, with more enthusiasm than she'd shown for any name thus far. So much so that Bakugo found it hard not to gravitate towards Aizawa's suggestion. Why Shadow? Zero asks. According to all the yelling and the shared accounts I've overheard, you can't seem to find it no matter what you do. And it's usually hiding in the shadows and under your beds. I don't need called out like this, Jiru mumbled from her spot at the table. Wait, where is the cat? Shoji asks, looking up from his book. The entire common room paused, looking around. Ajiro, ever the courageous soul, even bent down to look under the couch. Dark shadows slipped in and out of the couch with zero results as well. It's not in the couch or any of the chairs, Takoyami reported. It didn't go upstairs, Kuda signs. Bakugo sighed, scrapping his chair as he stood. He cleared his throat. Hey, shitflake. Is that what you call it? Seriously? Midoriya asked. What the hell else am I gonna call it? Not that. Why, Kirishima fell from his seat, the cat jumping from somewhere to rebound off his shoulder and onto the table, meowing at Bakugo's waist as it rubbed against his shirt. Bakugo smirked at Midoriya. Hey, Shadow, he says idly. The cat chirped up at him. The mighty, Ashido tacked on. It likes it, Kuda sign. All right, everyone in favor? Bakugo called out. Aye, was the unanimous shout. Aizawa glanced up from his paperwork, intending to catch Bakugo's eyes, but instead locked eyes with the cat. It pattered across the table towards him, chirping the entire way, stopping only to rub against his chin. Aizawa didn't give any outwards reaction, but Bakugo could see the twitch in his hands as he fought the urge to pet the cat. That settled it, then. They were all screwed. 1. Hunting means hello. Shinsu stood stock still in the common room, watching the cat. The rather lanky cat that was swishing its tail across the floor as it stared into his very soul. Creepy how it managed to do that, as if it were sizing him up. He'd expected being judged by his new dorm mates, even his new teachers, but he hadn't expected to feel so judged by a cat. Even the strays didn't size him up like this. He'd been expecting the same tiny kitten Midoriya, and a few of the others had been sending pictures and video of. He'd been expecting to see a white cat lounging around the dorm room, since it was laying down or sitting in almost every shot he was ever sent, even if half were blurry because it was getting up. He had not expected to walk into the dorms to be shown where he'd be taking his boxes in a few days, only to be met in the common room by a very observant guard cat. He was very used to cats, as it was, since he fed the local strays often enough. He knew the local cats well enough to the point that Kuda had brought it up more than once now how much they appreciated Shinsu leaving them food, and that he'd convinced Aizawa to let the flea-less ones into his capture weapon. It was apparently very warm. That said, he wasn't exactly eager to move. He'd rather be laying or sitting on the ground or on the couch, and having the giant white fluff ball on him. But he felt that if he moved, he'd get pounced. Kitten claws were sharp in a completely different way to adult cat claws. Neither were very fun to feel, either. Another swish of the tail and a sharpening of the eyes only convinced him further. He was meant to be moving in this weekend, and this standoff was cutting into his timetable by a lot. Bakugo came down the stairs and looked up from his phone to see the scene himself. He watched Shinsu for a long moment before clicking his tongue. The specific sound wasn't his usual tisk sound of disapproval or disappointment, so it wasn't that shocking when Shadow suddenly stood and waltzed up to Bakugo. Shadow climbed up his pant leg and shirt, coming to rest at a stand on his shoulders. Shinsu blinked at him. "What the fuck? You got something to say, Brainiac?" "I've got questions," Shinsu clarifies. "And I know that Deku has been sending you an entire album of this cat," Bakugo snaps. "You've never met her before." "It was a her." "No." Bakugo huffed, walking closer to him so that he was close enough to pet Shadow if he wanted to try. Of course, that meant that Shadow was close enough to claw him if she deemed him unworthy of the affection. And by God, he was going to be worthy to show to her affection. "So, if I'm reading this right," Shinsu began, motioning to the very odd and very much alive scarf that was curling around Bakugo's neck. "You trained her to do that." "I didn't do shit. She's only a few weeks old. She just likes to be there," Bakugo says. He returned to his phone and stalked off to the kitchen area. "Deku's in his room, Brainiac." Shinsu opted to not mention he had a name since he was sure that Bakugo knew his name by now and just shuffled up the stairs. Shadow watched him go, kneading Bakugo's shoulders a little. Bakugo shifted his shoulders, disrupting her kneading enough that she readjusted to be completely laying on the back of his neck. "Oi, oi, oi," he chastised. Shadow mewed at him disapprovingly, watching the staircase. Bakugo followed her gaze and scowled. He sighed, bending over so that Shadow could slip off easily. "Raise hell, you damn cotton ball." Shadow sprinted up the stairs. It wasn't long before Bakugo heard the distinct yelp of Midoriya and a startled cry from Shinsu. He'd have to ask Midoriya later which one was unfortunate enough to be pounced once Shadow got past the doorway. Really, it was their faults for not shutting the door. They'd all learned by now that if they hear Shadow running, someone was getting hunted in greeting. Ida had resorted to wearing an extra layer of fabric under his pants to protect his boosters from Shadow's claws. It did not deter Shadow from pouncing him in greeting. She merely aimed for his thighs. 2. Scarves are preferred. Aizawa scrolled through his messages, taking a brief break in his grading, when Midoriya came down the stairs with a yawn. "Good morning, sensei," he says tiredly. Aizawa hummed in greeting, a little too tired himself to really speak just yet, and kept scrolling as he caught up on the night Mimiri and a few of the staff had. She'd texted him all night, despite knowing he was on patrol, so he could be caught up by the time he'd gotten off shift that morning. Midoriya looked up and froze. White fur slipped between two strands of the capture weapon. Shadow's head popped out of the folds. Shadow locked eyes onto Midoriya and meowed. Aizawa flicked his gaze to Midoriya out of the corner of his eyes. Midoriya was stuck staring at Shadow, with the kind of weak look one only got when looking at something immeasurably cute. Shadow readjusted and meowed again, much quieter this time. Midoriya gave a pitiful whine and dropped to his knees, looking ready to cry. Aizawa promptly returned his gaze to the phone. He could feel Shadow slowly nestle back into the recesses of the capture weapon. Her toe beans were pressed against his neck and collarbone. He really empathized with Midoriya in that moment. But he wasn't going to resort to collapsing to the floor when he was already getting a free cuddling session out of the kitten. It was almost 3 minutes before Midoriya had composed himself enough to sit on one of the chairs in the common room. Aizawa could hear him muttering about the built-up warmth of the capture weapon and all those capabilities. "Principal Nedzu likes it for the same reason," Aizawa says easily. Midoriya paused to soak in that little tidbit and started mumbling faster, his hands moving as if he were writing in his notebook. Another pair of feet came down the stairs from the girl's side. Ashido's greeting of "good morning" was abruptly cut off the second Shadow's head peeked out of the capture weapon to see who had arrived. Aizawa watched her from his peripheral. She was stood frozen, hands still raised, mouth still open in a wide smile mid-sentence, and she was staring at Shadow. A chirp was all it took. She dropped like she'd been filled with cement and in tears. Metaphorical tears, but the sounds she was making would have fooled anyone. "It'll pass," Midoriya says, sounding entirely unconvinced. Ashido crawled forward, arm shakily outstretched. "Aizawa-sensei, please, for the love of Kami, let me pet her," Ashido begged. "That requires moving," Aizawa says coldly. "You're cruel," Ashido whispers, collapsing face first into the floor. Shadow watched her another moment before burying herself back into the capture weapon. Aizawa could feel her curling around his neck. He looked back at Ashido, who probably wasn't going to recover as fast as Midoriya had. If this was going to be the average reaction, he'd really have to invite some staff over. 3. Hide and seek is never going to end. "Has anyone seen Shadow?" Uraraka asks. It's bath time and Bakugo's setting up. The few heads in the common room swiveled around to the kitty corner. Shadow wasn't present, but that was merely one spot in the entire building she could be. "Did anyone leave the laundry room door open?" Satu asks. There was a tense silence as each classmate debated it. Satu stood with a sigh. "I'll go check the laundry." "She's not in the kitchen or the bathroom either," Uraraka states as he leaves. "Have you checked under your bed?" "I checked under everyone's bed," Uraraka says. "Well, Ashido's door was locked." "She and Kirishima are having some couple time," Suro says. He propped his feet onto the coffee table. He suddenly shot up, making his way to the kitchen. "Wait, I got an idea." "I checked the kitchen, though," Uraraka mumbles, following him. Suro pushed open the cracked pantry door. He flicked on the lights and looked around the shelves. Uraraka stood in the doorway with him, watching him until he seemed to zero in on one of the corners. He walked over with a snort, bending over. Uraraka bent next to him. He moved a bag of flour to the side and Shadow's head perked up from where she had been snoozing. She gave them a little mew and blinked tiredly at them. "Ooh!" Uraraka reached into the shelf, pulling Shadow out. Shadow didn't fight back or make a noise, just went limp against Uraraka's shoulder and collar as she cradled her. "How'd you know she'd be in here?" "I found her hiding behind the flour the other night," Suro admitted. "Saw the door was cracked and figured it was worth a look." Uraraka walked out of the pantry with Shadow still nestling her head against her neck. Gyro glanced up and laughed, raising her phone. Wait, Ashido will die," Gyro said, snapping a picture when Uraraka paused to pose. When Uraraka came back to the bathroom with a sleeping kitten against her neck, Bakugo stared at her a long moment. She was about to ask if he were all right when he sighed, set the soap bottle down, and came up to scratch Shadow between the ears. "Never speak of this," he mumbles. Uraraka shot him a wide smile. "Never thought of it." Gyro skirted around the couch, keeping a good distance from one end specifically every time she entered the room on that side. Shinsu watched her, raising a brow at the action. "Are you allergic to couches?" he asks. "I'm allergic to claws." Shinsu snorted, watching her take her seat on the opposite side of the room. He was sitting close to the couch, in one of the chairs on that side of the couch she tended to avoid, and stretched his foot closer to the edge. Jiru glanced up and shot up straighter in her chair. "Dude, no." A little paw shot out from between the cushions, catching Shinsu's foot. He yelped, pulling his foot back. Shadow's claw caught in the fabric, meaning he pulled more of Shadow's leg out of the cushion space. Shadow's head soon followed, mewling disapproving at Shinsu. Shinsu laughed, reaching down to shuck off his sock. It disappeared into the couch along with Shadow. Oh, that's where she was hiding all this time, he says. She likes to go for ankles and toes, Jiru says, slightly bitter. She pulled her legs up in the chair. Wear thick socks. Is that year-round? We're kind of just rolling with it just in case. 4. Everything is a tree. The kitten climbed up their legs. Specifically, she climbed up Bakugo's leg and up to his shoulder to perch there when he ignored her too long. She'd started to climb his leg to get his attention for food, for play, for cuddles. For scratches, it had turned into a game to find out what she wanted. Bakugo took it in stride, simply demanding what she wanted with the same brashness he showed everyone. Shadow watched Bakugo from across the common room, her tail flicking in the open air below her cat tree perch where she was lounging. Suddenly, she darted off the cat tree, sprinting across the common room until she'd hit Bakugo's ankles. He barely reacted anymore when he felt her claws on his pant leg as she climbed. A quiet fucker was all the reaction he gave this time. Shinsu snickered from where he lounged in the common room, watching the display in front of him. Bakugo had just been about to enter the kitchen when Shadow had enacted her assault. She was at the base of his back when he lifted his arm and turned to glare at her as best he could. He was certainly flexible enough to make eye contact with her. The fuck do you want, eh? Shadow meowed loudly, climbing up the rest of the way until she reached his shoulders and scrambled up to settle on them. Shinsu raised a brow at him. If he'd been chosen as a tree, he'd be praising the kitten to high heaven to make sure it happened again. He turned away, catching sight of Todoroki staring at the pair himself. Even as Bakugo swore out his questions to the space invader of a kitten, Todoroki just looked envious. It was hard to tell on such a stoic face, but the slight eye twitch was all Shinsu needed. Jealous? Shinsu asks. Todoroki startled, swiftly taking his eyes off Bakugo and onto Shinsu. Shinsu smirked at him. No. Liar. Hey, Shinsu, wanna see something that'll kill ya? Ashido asked, looking like she was vibrating in her seat. Depends. How swift is it? Shinsu asks. Ashido snorted, pointing back to Bakugo. Watch. Shinsu looked back over the couch's back. Bakugo had started to ignore Shadow's existence. The kitten mewed at him, pawing his cheek. His scowl remained resolute. Shadow sniffed at his cheek next and rubbed her cheek against his. Shinsu could hear Ashido and Hagakure both cooing. Bakugo shot them a sidelong glare. You got something to say, raccoon eyes. Show her attention, you monster, Hagakure shouted. Bakugo scoffed at her, briefly returning his attention to his phone. Shadow rubbed their cheeks together again. He sighed, turning to glare at the cat, only for Shadow to bop their noses together, immediately followed by a lick to his nose. Bakugo was left staring at the cat. Ashido slapped her hand on the table. That's what I'm talking about. Wait, let her do it again. I wasn't recording, Jiru shouted. Fuck off. Shadow wasn't able to give Bakugo very many instances of a lick or a nose kiss following that. Whenever she went for it, Bakugo would harshly turn his head, forcing her to land the attempt on his cheek instead. Especially after she climbed him specifically to try. Besides Bakugo, when Shadow climbed a classmate, it was always met with a shout and a jump and a kitten holding on desperately so as not to be flung off the clothing she'd latched onto. Uraraka had once inadvertently started floating, trapping both in the air until Asui could bring them back down with her tongue. Shadow didn't jump on Uraraka anymore unless Uraraka could see her, which was more unnerving than if she pounced with Uraraka unawares, given that it meant it required eye contact half the time. Uraraka was forced to watch Shadow's eyes widen right before she started her pursuit. Jiru was quick to avoid any instances of Shadow's climbing attempts by sprinting away until the pursuit turned into a game of tag. Yaoyorozu and Todoroki were constantly prepared and hoping for the interaction, so they never reacted much, if for no other reason than to ensure Shadow completed the climb. The day that Shinsu got a selfie of Todoroki with Shadow on his shoulders, smiling wider than he thought the boy was capable. He knew that he was just as screwed as the rest of them. Shoji had presented something of a challenge the first time, Shinsu was told. Shadow had tried to climb up his side like she traditionally did for everyone, only to reach a snag when she hit the bottom set of his arms. From then on, she went up his back or front exclusively, meaning there was still a 50-50 shot that he saw her coming and didn't surprise the dorm with a loud scream. Takoyami would rush away to perch on something that would impede the climb like the fridge. It was a few weeks before Shadow had tried climbing Shinsu. He hadn't been paying attention. He'd been scrolling through his phone waiting for Midoriya so they could walk to class. Shadow had been stalking him, apparently, from the cat tree. Midoriya had hit the bottom of the stairs, the same moment that Shadow leapt from the cat tree and sprinted across the furniture. She landed on the floor, her resulting thump the only warning that Shinsu got before he had claws at his thigh. Oh, what the fuck? Shinsu had nearly dropped his phone, spinning around to try and find the source, only for the source of the claws to climb up to his back. Midoriya was laughing at him. Laughing. The traitor. By the time Shadow had come to rest at his shoulders, he'd figured out what was happening. Midoriya had taken so many photos. It was a week later that Shadow had tried to climb Ida next. Ida had come down to the common room to find everyone who was joining in the tutoring session for the night. It had gotten a little on the chilly side, so he'd grabbed his thicker and large pair of sweats, ones that hid the shapes of his leg engines. Shadow was perched on the armrest of a chair, watching Jiru play a game on her phone, when she turned to watch Ida instead. She'd dropped down, prancing over to him. "Anyone who needs help in chemistry is welcome to join us at the dining table," Ida announced. He turned towards the dining area, where Yaoyorozu had already started setting up with Hagakure, when Shadow jumped. She'd latched onto his thigh and was quick to make it up to his side before he had screamed, and then immediately Recipro burst into the nearest wall. Shadow fell off, unable to keep her hold with a sudden speed shift, and landed on the floor, looking around in alarm. Ida hit the wall, grabbing her attention again. Her tail swished back and forth, her body set to sprint should she have to, until she started to relax when all Ida did was moan in pain and lay on the floor. She turned to Bakugo, mewling confusedly. Bakugo doubled over, cackling into his chair's armrest. "Ida, are you all right?" Yaoyorozu asks. "I'm fine." "Bakubro, stop laughing," Kaminari shouted, failing to hide his own laughter. Shadow pranced over to Bakugo's chair, climbing up the armrest and coming to rest at his shoulders. "Oi, get off." "She lost her last tree. Let her have this," Ciro said between laughs. 5. Warm is warm. The snow had hit them without much warning. It had been confirmed not to be caused by a quirk. It was merely one of those instances of weather phenomenon, so they weren't on lockdown. It was an oddly normal event that, of course, was still seen as annoying, but also somewhat loved by everyone at UA. Depending on if you were a winter person or not, of course. Bakugo was far from a winter person. He woke up cold, had to wait longer for the shower water to heat up, and came down to the kitchen wrapped in a UA sweater and scarf. Even if the snow would be melted by tomorrow, and he had Todoroki to use as a space heater until then, it wouldn't be fast enough. He couldn't even go on his morning run with the snow this high. It messed with his quirk, and he hated the feeling of being cold. It always felt like it went right to his bones. He'd finished donning the sweater and scarf before he had even hit the breakfast table. And even as he sat in class, he kept the scarf on. Everyone else save for Asui had shed their extra articles of clothing once they'd settled into class. Typically, Bakugo would have as well, since the whole building was kept at a rather good temperature. Kirishima glanced over at him for the umpteenth time, checking to make sure Bakugo wasn't allowing himself to be overheated due to sheer stubborn determination of something. A small murp sounded off from the scarf. Kirishima paused in his note-taking. He looked up at the scarf. The fabric shifted slightly. Bakugo was stone-faced, taking notes like nothing was different. Kirishima looked back at the scarf, leaning over to try and look inside. Shadow was curled up around Bakugo's neck, nuzzled into the scarf, fast asleep. Kirishima gasped, his palms slipping on the top of the desk, and he collapsed to the floor with a loud clatter. Bakugo sat still in his seat, not even turning at the racket beside him. Aizawa turned to him, raising his brow. "Kirishima, are you all right?" he asks. "Why, yes, sensei," Kirishima said quickly, scrambling to right his desk. "Lose your mind, shitty hair?" Bakugo asks. "That's low," Kirishima whispers. "You know what that was about." Zero and Jiru both looked between the two. Kaminari shot Kirishima a confused look. Bakugo glanced up at him, shrugging. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Mido, confirm I'm not crazy," Kirishima hissed over at him. Zero snickered, looking between the two. Midoriya stared at him a moment before leaning over to look into the scarf. He fell back into his chair, covering his face with his hands. Kaken. "You're seeing things, Deku," Bakugo says evenly. He stared at the front of the room, making eye contact with Aizawa, just waiting for the man to continue on as if nothing was happening. Another, softer, merp sounded off from his scarf. It sounded far louder than it was, given the class was silent. Now, Hagakure whirled around in her seat. "What was that?" she asks. "You're hearing things," Bakugo says. "Must be a gas leak." "Dude," Jiru snorted. Aizawa sighed, pinching his brow. "How long has she been in your scarf?" Bakugo. "I don't know what you're talking about." Shadow's head popped up from the scarf. She yawned. Hagakure made a strangled noise, reaching up to pet her, only for her hand to be smacked away. "You're all delusional," Bakugo says. Kaken. "It's a shame, really." Kaken. "Fucking extras." Shadow mewed. Hagakure's head hit Bakugo's notebook. 6. Pillow requirements and nicknames. Everyone in the dorm was a designated pillow, should Shadow decide as much. That had become apparent from the first few weeks of photos shared between Shinsu and Midoriya. Shadow would curl up with anyone and everyone. She seemed to enjoy Bakugo and Todoroki the most. Kuda had become a designated best pillow, self-proclaimed, within days. Or self-proclaimed until he explained that he was, in fact, a best pillow in Shadow's eyes. Shinsu had been lounging on the couch, doing his homework, with Shadow pressed up against his side. He was laid out on the couch on his back, legs propped on the coffee table, in such an angle that could not be comfortable. But he'd be damned if he moved with a sleepy kitten pressed against his side. Kuda had come down into the common room and found him first. He sat down beside him, leaving Shadow to stretch and press her paws against his thigh. Shinsu nodded to him and watched as he signed back. "She likes you as a best pillow, too." "What? That's a legit thing she has?" Shinsu laughed. Kuda nodded excitedly, signing rapidly. "She has a handful of classmates who qualify. Me, you, Bakugo, Todoroki, sensei." "Aizawa sensei qualifies?" Shinsu asks, snorting. Wait, that makes sense. Even Principal Nedzu loves sneaking into that scarf." "You're calm." "I'm quiet." "Todoroki is warm or cool depending on what she wants." "Bakugo is dad." Shinsu stared at him. "I'm sorry, what?" "She calls him dad." "Oh, that is not what I thought you meant," Shinsu admitted. Kuda bloomed red, hiding his face. Sorry, I just couldn't think of anything else, ha ha ha." "Anyway," Kuda continued, sighing, "Bakugo is called dad because he found her. I think it's nice." "I think it's great blackmail material," Shinsu says, smirking. "Then you didn't hear it from me. You're the only one who talks to animals." "You didn't hear it from me." Kuda signed frantically. He got up after that, moving quickly to the kitchen for whatever he'd come for initially. Shinsu shrugged, returning to his homework. More and more classmates filed into the room, taking up couches and chairs and space around the table. Eventually, Bakugo fell sideways into a chair, draping his legs over the edge, scrolling through his phone. Shadow perked up at his entrance, watching him with her eyes, and then finally abandoning Shinsu. He watched after her. She came up to Bakugo's chair, sitting at the base of it at the armrest. Bakugo didn't seem to acknowledge her presence until he patted his stomach once. Shadow immediately leapt up, taking a small breather of a hop at the cushion before stopping on Bakugo's stomach. She curled right up, burying her face into her paws. Bakugo didn't react past reaching down absently with his free hand to stroke the Shadow's head. Shinsu snapped a photo. It was after dinner that Shinsu tracked Kuda down outside, talking to the squirrels again. He settled down next to him, taking a handful of nuts that Kuda offered, starting to hand them off to squirrels who were brave enough to venture close to him. So, if she calls Bakugo her dad, what does she call everyone else's dad? Shinsu asks cheekily. Kuda turned to him, setting the nuts on the ground in a pile for the squirrels to ravage. Are you really trying to imply that Sensei is not also your dad? Rude, but fair. So, what does she call him? Aizawa is called Big Bean, though she does refer to him as Scarf Man. Ahahaha, seriously. Shinsu laughed, his ribs already starting to hurt. Kuda nodded, sending Shinsu into another fit of laughter. He had to set his own small amount of nuts down, patting his side. Oh, that is so good. I have to tell him next training session. Oh, please, Kuda, please let me do that. You can't. Oh, fine. Kuda relented. He sighed, scratching a squirrel between the ears. Do they usually act so, pet-like? No. But they've learned good behavior earns them rewards like pets. HM. So we really did pamper cats and dogs into submission with pets, huh? No. It's more complicated than that. Doesn't seem that way? So, what'd she call me? Purple one. But you're also apparently great for petting. Yeah, okay, Shinsu sighed. I'll take it. She calls Izuku tree, Shadow is heater. And she also calls Bakugo my human. This is just so great, Shinsu wheezed. Wait, what does she call Zash Yamada sensei and Nimuri sensei? Loud and mom. Mom. 7. Bad feeding habits and alternative scratch post trademark are an inevitability. Bakugo's eye twitched. Todoroki's hand moved slowly down again, a piece of chicken disappearing when it reappeared to use his fork again. The man himself kept his face completely stoic through the interaction every time. Bakugo once again had to hand it to him for keeping his poker face at almost all times. It couldn't have been easy. He caught Kirishima doing it next. And then Ishido. Then Hagakure. Then Takoyami, Shoji, Zero. And then Midoriya, and that was it. The gloves were off. He dove his head under the table, catching sight of Shadow eating bits of grilled chicken. Bakugo shot up in his chair, slamming his hands on the table. Are you all fucking kidding me? He screeched. Every individual at the table jerked up to look at him. Honestly, he'd slammed the table so as not to blow it up. Half the table immediately tried to avert his gaze, failing spectacularly in the process. The other half looked rightfully admonished, and he hadn't even started yet. Oh, what a good night it would be. Bakugo tusked at them all. This shit is why she's fat, assholes. She's not fat, Ashido screamed. She picked Shadow up, the cat going limp and elongated to a seemingly impossible degree, with Shadow letting out a long mewl. She's just got a lot of fluff. It's fat, you ass. It's an abundance of fur. Now you know words like abundance. Where the fuck was that in class? Uraraka watched the two ping-pong their argument, with Shadow slowly slipping through Ashido's grip until she finally set her down. Shadow slunk along the table towards Aizawa of all people. At first, she'd thought she was headed towards Todoroki, but she stopped right behind Aizawa's seat. Aizawa was immobile for a moment, until he slowly reached his hand down, and Shadow ate a piece of chicken from his palm. Uraraka's knee hit the table. You got something to say, Pink Cheeks? No, sir. PFFT, ha 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 ha. Sir? Kaminari laughed. Uraraka kicked him under the table. Shut up, I want alive, she shouted back at him. None of you are getting out of this unscathed, bitches, Bakugo shouted, clapping his hands together with an explosion. You're all helping her lose the fat you put on. Oda raised his hand. I didn't feed her more than twice, so can I be exempt from the majority? Bakugo leveled his gaze at him. Run, glasses. Aizawa sighed, standing to follow the two as they burst out of the back door, screaming and shouting. Uraraka held her breath until he'd closed the door behind him, and then she turned to the table at large. Holy shit, she breathed. Jiro turned to her, brow raised, with a hum. He fed her, too. Acha, if you want to graduate, I suggest you don't mention it, Yairazu says evenly. Uraraka whipped her head around to her. You knew? Of course. I followed his methods to get away with it myself, she admitted shamelessly. What? Aizawa re-entered the room with both boys in his scarf. The room fell silent immediately, up until dinner was considered done after Aizawa was done lecturing Bakugo for damage to the table, and Ida for almost bursting the door off its hinges. Midoriya had taken Bakugo to lounge and calm down on the couch afterward, given Ashido and Kirishima were both on cleanup duty. It wasn't more than 20 minutes later that they heard a small grunt. Midoriya looked up to find the source, whilst Bakugo just continued to scan the study guide in his hands, pointedly ignoring everyone else in the room. Possibly for the remainder of the night. The grunt came again, and Midoriya turned around on the couch. He blanched, looking at the kitchen table. Bakugo caught sight of the direction off his gaze and groaned. He turned as well, staring dumbfounded. Kirishima was sat with his arm, hardened up to his elbow, stretched over the table. Shadow was wrapped around his forearm and gnawing at it like something rabid. Her eyes were completely blown out. Bakugo gaped at the sight. Midoriya gave a small, confused noise. Kirishima looked up at them. For a few moments nothing was said. Shadow readjusted, clutching his arm like she did her fish toys, kicking his hardened first with her hind feet. She let out a little hiss, prompting the attention of most of the room that heard it. Aizawa looked up from this grating, sighed, and returned to his work. What the fuck? Kiri, what the fuck? Bakugo breathed. She likes it. How many bad behaviors am I gonna have to see from you assholes? What? She's trying to sever your arm off, dumbass. No, she isn't. She's playing, Kirishima defended. I did this with the strays at my street. And they probably attacked anyone else dumb enough to try playing with them, you idiot, Bakugo spat. Jiro and Kaminari were howling behind them. Jiro gasped, holding up her phone to capture the moment. Kirishima raised his arm, shadow hanging off it, still going at it animatedly. You're just jealous, he says. I'll fucking end you. Holy shit, Takoyami whispered. He is jealous. Shut your trap, bird brain, I am not, Bakugo screamed. Shadow stopped gnawing on Kirishima to look up at him, her tail swishing and mewed. Kirishima's face contorted and Bakugo slapped his hand to his forehead. I did not just see your face go into. I'll let you kill me to make you happy levels of whipped just now, Kiri. Why, yeah. Kirishima, for fuck's sake. How can you say no to her? I have a spine. Ashido snorted. Whipped. You're one to talk. Oi. 8. Nuzzling. Aizawa leaned back a little, Shadow pushing him back as she took up a spot in his lap, dropping down from the table. Her tail brushed past his face as she did so. It wasn't an uncommon occurrence, especially when she got larger and had to do more to push anyone at the table back when she deemed them her pillow, but it was murderous every time. Ashido was stifling laughter, recording on her phone. Aizawa sighed, readjusting to let Shadow remain. This is the best, Ashido whispered. Best day of my life. Aizawa tried to focus on the papers in front of him. He really did. Bakugo could almost see the strain in his eyes as he refused to pet Shadow. Shadow, seemingly oblivious or seemingly petty, stretched her neck and poked her nose on Aizawa's chin. The same time Ashido squealed, Aizawa's head hit the table. Sensei. Leave me, he ordered. Shadow's head popped up between the table and his shoulder, and she chirped. Ashido had to forcibly stop the recording so she could double over in her own chair, wheezing laughter overtaking any semblance of words. Jesus fucking Christ, you're all so whipped, Bakugo muttered. No, Ashido wailed. You should have said that sooner, when I was recording. Oh, fuck off. I am not going to be your social media bait, Bakugo snapped. Shadow nuzzled her cheek into Aizawa's neck, starting to purr. Aizawa had to squeeze his eyes shut, forcing himself into sitting back in the chair. It was almost painful to leave the soft fur. But he had to, or he'd lose every last semblance of composure he had. He refused to snuggle the cat in front of two of the loudest students in the entire class, one of which was one of the worst gossipers and would definitely tell Mimiri about it. He'd already been subjected to blindness. He really didn't want to be deaf, especially from people who didn't even have a quirk like Yamada's. Aizawa carefully lifted Shadow up, ignoring the protesting mules and Ashido's refusals, to set her gingerly on the floor. He gathered his papers and stood from the table. Can't handle it, sensei? Bakugo asks, raising a brow at him. Another word, and you run 16 laps, Aizawa said. He paused his exit when Shadow meowed up at him, sitting right in his path and swishing her tail. He regarded her a moment before leaning down and scratching her behind the ears. When he pulled away, she almost stood on her hind legs to follow his hand. Oh my God, Ashido whispered. Aizawa was certain she wouldn't survive the school year. 9. Bananas will not survive. Uraraka had just wanted a glass of water. It was too early on a Sunday for anything else to occupy her brain. But the universe had a cruel sense of humor, and a strange sense of humor as well. She'd gotten to the fridge before noticing that Shadow was sitting on the counter and sizing up the freshly bought bananas. Shadow was giving the bushel a steady glare. Then the first strike came, and immediately following was the rapid-fire succession of paw strikes. Uraraka gaped at Shadow as she swatted the bananas indiscriminately. Uraraka snorted, starting to double over a little. She slid her glass onto the counter and approached Shadow, who had started to meow and mewl while swatting. Shadow, Uraraka laughs. Shadow, they're just bananas. Shadow flicked her gaze onto Uraraka and meowed loudly before returning to her battery. The bananas were starting to break apart. Shadow, they're already dead, Uraraka laughs. Shadow paused, sitting on the counter. She held Uraraka's gaze steadily before raising her paw and punting the bananas straight off the counter. Shadow. Shadow jumped down and Uraraka knelt to pick the bushel up. Shadow beat her to it, swatting one of them until it started to turn to mush on the floor. Uraraka watched, processing the sight before her, as Shadow started on a second banana. She was utterly decimating the poor fruit until Uraraka tried to pick her up. She started to yowl, loudly. No, no, no. Why are you fucking torturing the cat? Bakugo asks, coming into the room from the boys' side. I wasn't. She's torturing the bananas, Uraraka says. Bakugo stared at her. He blinked. What? She's just hitting them, Uraraka says. She's being horrible about it. Not my problem, Bakugo says, turning right on his heel. Shadow wriggled from Uraraka's grasp and slaps a piece of partially amputated banana. It smacked the wall with a loud splat, webbing outward. Bakugo paused. He turned around enough to see the carnage and then started to laugh. Uraraka puffed up her cheeks. She stomped towards him. Bitch. She slapped his shoulder, his feet lifting off the ground immediately. Bakugo tried to snatch at her. but she bent out of the way, leaving him to float up to the tall ceiling. Oi, undo it, you bitch. I will if you help me clean it up, since you think it's so funny, Uraraka called up at him. Bakugo pressed his hands to the ceiling, keeping his head from bumping the ceiling. Never. All right, then fine. She patted her own shoulder, sending herself up to the ceiling. What the fuck are you doing? Well, I'm not cleaning it up alone, and it's your cat. So, Uraraka shrugged, flipping upside down to land her feet on the ceiling, crossing her arms. Bakugo gaped at her. How fucking tired are you? You're going to float yourself. We all float here, Uraraka says evenly. Bakugo was silent until she looked at him, uncertainly. I appreciate the reference, but fuck you. Shadow watched the two as they started at it. She swished her tail to and fro, meowing steadily louder as they fought. Shinsu yawned as he came in, looking over the scene. He looked down at Shadow, utterly confused. She was back to swatting the remaining bananas, occasionally swatting one onto the wall or the side of the counter. Shinsu picked her up, holding her top half up, earring an unnecessarily long meow in return. He took the pause in their arguments to look up at them, tiredly. I'm too exhausted to process what the fuck is going on. But what the fuck is going on? He asks. She was murdering the bananas. No, you killed them, Uraraka wailed, seeing the result of Shadow's unsupervised moments. Bakugo sighed, letting himself float until he was face and body to the ceiling. Like a reverse floor lay. That answers nothing, Shinsu says. Bakugo wouldn't help me clean it up, Uraraka says. How tired are you? That's what I'm saying, Bakugo shouted. I'm shocked he hasn't killed you, Shinsu mumbled. He cradled Shadow more securely in his arms. I'm not cleaning it up, either. What? Uraraka shouts. Not my cat. Shinsu. No. Uraraka calls after him as he turned heel and walked out. He could at least get some cuddles before Bakugo and Uraraka came for him later for ditching them. He sent a quick text to Asui on his way back to his room. 10. Storms. Ashido fell onto the couch next to Bakugo, sinking into the overused cushion with ease. She kept scrolling her phone, hearing thunder rolling in from a distance. She looked up at the windows. The Sunday afternoon had been sunny and bright an hour ago before the storm had started to roll in. She grumbled, pulling half of the blanket Bakugo was hogging across her own lap. And here I was thinking I'd be able to go shopping, she bemoaned. Bakugo snorted, ruffling her hair between her horns. Go after class tomorrow. I have to study after class. Then suck it up and go when the rain stops. It can't last all night. It might last past curfew, Ashido grumbled, sinking into the cushions. Bakugo considered the possibility and hummed. It was, unfortunately, entirely possible. Ashido dropped her phone once a clap of thunder rocked the windows. The sound itself barely registered to her given how many times she'd heard Bakugo's explosions. But what had caught her attention was the zooming pod of white barreling towards her from the kitty corner. Said white bullet hit her square in the stomach and buried itself into her shirt. Ashido scrambled to make sense of what had landed in her lap. It took her a moment to recognize Shadow was burying herself into Ashido's sides, trying to wriggle between her and the couch. Shadow was mewling and crying the entire time. Ashido gave a pathetic whine, doubling over the cat, making what could effectively be called a cave out of her own body and the couch. Bakugo glanced over at her unimpressed, catching sight of Shadow under her body. What the fuck are you doing? Another clap of thunder hit, and Shadow gave a loud whine, digging further into the cushions and Ashido's sides, her claws picking up some of the couch fabric as she did so. She's scared, Ashido says, her lip already quivering. Bakugo blinked slowly at her. She's scared? Bakugo looked down at Shadow again, noticing that she was shaking. Shadow's head turned towards him, her pupils blown out wide. Ah! Shadow darted out from beneath Ashido, barreling headfirst into Bakugo's side, claws and all. His instinct was to double over where Shadow's claws were digging into his side. Ashido caught him by the arm, forcing him to stay upright. Don't double over. Don't double over. Speak for yourself, Bakugo growled. Shadow was busy nestling herself in his lap, taking up the space in his crossed legs like an actual nest, under the blanket. He looked down at her, lifting the blanket slightly, meeting wide eyes and shaking fur. He lowered the blanket. What's going on? Uraraka asks, coming up from behind. I heard Bakugo scream. Shadow the Mighty is scared of the storm, Ashido says. She knelt down to peek under the blanket at Shadow. She's hiding in Bakugo's lap. She dug her claws into my spleen, Bakugo grumbled, scrolling through his phone. Uraraka nodded, glancing over. Her eyes focused on Bakugo's phone screen. He flicked his eyes up at her and turned the phone, pushing her face away. Oi, mind your fucking business. Did that say pet therapist? She asks cheekily. We need a pet therapist? Yaoyorozu asks from the kitchen. Shadow's afraid of the storm, Ashido says. She's petrified. Another clap of thunder invited more claws into Bakugo's thighs. He bit back a groan and started scrolling through his phone again. You and half can fight over who pays for it, Bakugo shouted back at the group in the kitchen. Yaoyorozu and Todoroki glanced at each other. You paid for the vet. You paid for the shopping. It's my turn. Bakugo whipped his head around at them. Uraraka was giggling, her face still being shoved by his hand. Are you two seriously going to debate this? Todoroki regarded him quietly for a second. He turned to Yaoyorozu, who said, determined, It's my turn. No. Oh my god, Shadow has 2 sugar parents, Uraraka giggled. Bakugo sighed heavily, turning back to the living room. He rested his hand on the lump in his lap, finding Shadow's head. Shadow mewed, peeking out from the blanket to rub her head into his hand properly. Ashido squealed beside him quietly. You're so whipped, he mutters. You're being so cute, she shoots right back. Bakugo shot her a glare. Don't get used to it, he snaps. This isn't going to be a normal thing. It would be less than a month before another large storm hit, and Shadow was launching herself at the next nearest person once again. It took 3 hours of debate for the class to decide on if it was the best or worst decision for Shadow to have launched herself at Aizawa of all people. It was decided it was the best option once Uraraka had produced her prized photo of Shadow hugging Aizawa's neck, face buried under his chin, and Aizawa holding her weight in his capture weapon, which he'd wrapped around his neck and her body like a security blanket, until Shadow had seen Bakugo. That is, and promptly leapt from Aizawa's neck to Bakugo's arms. Not a normal thing, huh? Ashido called from the dining table. Shut the fuck up. Minori tore her hair out of the hair tie with a sigh, pulling the tie down over her wrist. She hated interviews that barred the hero costume. Casual and personal, be damned, she hated wearing business casual when she had to be appropriate with it. Stuffy and tight, and not in the fun way. And appropriate, of course, meaning nothing too sexy. Think of the children bullshit that she was forced to adhere to. For now. Nedzu had, of course, assured her that she could change the moment she got back to the teacher's lounge. But this interview about female heroes in primarily male workplaces had been good PR for the school. So she'd been inclined to at least adhere to the dress code set by the news station. It had been far too easy of an interview, as well. Kami knew Nedzu wouldn't allow any hostile workplace environments if he could help it, so it was a breeze. She still couldn't wait to get out of the dress pants and blouse, though. She turned the corner, intent on rushing into the staff room as fast as possible to change for her classes, but stopped dead in her tracks. A fluffy white cat was stood in the hall, staring at her. She stared back, sizing it up. Its golden eyes flicked over her face, and it sat down, tilting its head. It looked familiar. Mimiri walked up to it. surprised when it didn't flee only long enough to notice that it had a collar around its neck. She held her hands out, gently, and smiled wide when the cat didn't rush away. She coddled it in her arms with an appreciative hum. Resting the cat's weight on her hip, she took the name tag in her hands. Shadow, the mighty. If found, please return to UA class Aizawa Shada. Oh, was that so? So, this was the mystery cat she'd seen behind Aizawa once or twice in the video calls. How it got out of the dorm, she wasn't sure, but she chuckled darkly. Readjusting the cat in her arms, she snuggled her face into the cat's back fur, relishing in how soft it was, and giggling when Shadow, what an adorable name for such a white cat, snuggled up against her neck until the whiskers tickled her. She readjusted her hold, feeling it pulling playfully at the hair tie on her wrist. She made her way quickly to the classroom, giggling when Shadow tickled her wrist with a brush of her teeth, trying to firmly grasp the hair tie. Nimiri caught the door with the toe of her boot and slid it open with a loud clack. She stepped into the room, which fell silent at her entrance. She stared Aizawa in the eyes, smiling wide, cradling Shadow. You traitorous fuck. Aizawa spotted Shadow and stared. Everyone was staring. Shadow chirped, thumping her tail against Nimiri's hip. Nimiri held her up, leaving Shadow's lower half dangling. But the cat didn't protest. Bitch, you best explain yourself. It's the therapy cat, Aizawa deadpans. For who? Did you read the tag? What, for all of them? Aizawa looked back down at his lesson plan. Therapy cat. Nimiri deposited Shadow onto Ajuro's desk, purely because it was the closest. The cat ignored his glare as it stepped all over his notes and books. Once Nimiri had turned, Shadow wasted no time hopping from Ajiro to Shiro's desk, pushing his notebook to the floor in her slide on the wood. She then hopped diagonally to Bakugo's desk, catching herself on the free space in the corner. The disrespect, Ajiro mumbles. The favoritism, Jiru adds. The rejection, Hagakure grumbles, turning around in her seat. The sad sacks before me, Bakugo spat. Oi. I cannot believe you, Nimiri says, turning back to Aizawa, blatantly ignoring the cat and children. You had a kitty in this school, and you never officially told me. I'm offended, absconded, insulted. Officially. The video calls betrayed you. You're being dramatic, that's Yamada's job. Aizawa says. Ashido and Hagakure snickered in their seats. Nimiri pouted, turning back to Shadow, to gesture at them. She stopped, staring as Shadow climbed over and rested on Bakugo's shoulders like a rather large scarf. She stared a long minute in the silence. Aizawa, without looking up from his sheet, said in the same deadpan tone. I'm waiting, Nim. Fuck you. Don't tell Yamada. Oh, I am definitely telling Yamada, Nimiri snickered. Best prepare yourself, asshole. You're getting so much flack for this. Shadow didn't stop randomly showing up in the school. Nimiri had so far been the only one to find Shadow lurking in the halls before she'd managed to make her way to the classroom. Despite how desperately Yamada would search when it was his turn for hall monitor duty, none of the other staff had managed to even hear of a student spotting the furball. How she managed to get inside when the main doors were shut had been a mystery, until Aizawa had done a morning check of the grounds and found that Lunch Rush had a habit of leaving a window cracked open to let excess steam or smoke escape while he cooked. Apparently, he hadn't noticed the massive white cat occasionally climb inside and slink out the swinging door of the cafeteria and then to the hallway. From there was no door blocking her way through the halls and stairs to find Class A's homeroom. Aizawa had merely sighed and returned to the classroom. He had a funny feeling that if they closed the window, Shadow would just check every window on the ground floor until she found an open one. Shadow was grooming on a windowsill when she was found again. Monoma had stopped in the hall, a good few feet from her, staring at her as she licked her paw. It wasn't exactly a common sight that one came across. An animal in the hallway that wasn't their principal. When she looked up at him, locking eyes and staring, he wasn't sure how to react. Logically, he rationalized. The cat was smarter than average to have found its way onto school grounds without setting off the alarm. Given the collar around her neck, she was clearly owned. That, combined with how calmly she was holding his gaze, told Monoma that she was at least accustomed to people to the point that the sheer dense population of the school didn't bother her. He wondered idly how long it had been in the hallway. Shadow, seemingly having made a decision, hopped down from the window to prance up to him. Monoma watched it, clutching the paperwork that Kan had given him to deliver, and didn't move. The cat still hadn't broken eye contact. He had the unnerving feeling that it was sizing him up. Perhaps it had some sort of intelligence-based quirk like Nedzu. If that was the case, he did not want anything to do with it. He wasn't even considering petting it. Then, the bell rang, and it tried to climb him. Monoma bolted backwards down the hall with a surprised scream at the claws that had dug into his leg like he was some kind of tree. Students were filling the hallway, and he had just passed Class A's door when it slid open. Shadow pushed off him, setting him off balance, and he fell right onto his butt to the floor and rushed off towards the classroom door. Monoma watched, alongside other students, as Bakugo stood in the doorway, staring Shadow down as she bounded over with meows. Shadow jumped up and climbed right up Bakugo's side and arm to come to a standing rest on his shoulders. Bakugo looked where she'd come, his glare landing on Monoma. "Don't touch the fucking cat," he snaps, before turning back inside the classroom. Uraraka slipped past him, cooing at Shadow. She paused in the hallway, suddenly aware of the group of students that had started to block the flow of traffic at the oddly calm site. Bakugo's lack of reaction to a cat climbing him like a tree was the highlight of the week for them. She zeroed in on Monoma. She reached out a hand. "Monoma, are you all right?" she asked. He ignored her given hand, standing on his own, and gestured towards the classroom as more of class filed out. The sounds of several students cooing at the cat heard from inside. "What the hell did I just witness?" he asks. "Does Lord Explosion Murder seriously have a cat?" "Oh, you mean Shadow," Uraraka says cheerily. "She's the class cat, actually." "Therapy cat," Todoroki corrects on his way past. Monoma scoffed at the notion and Todoroki stopped, turning back to him. "Shadow is a registered therapy cat. Has been for a while now. We're not sure how she's getting out of the dorms, or how she found her way here," Uraraka admits. She shrugged, joining Todoroki as he started down the hall again. "She's really friendly." "She clawed at my leg," Monoma shouted after them. "Do you think we can get a cat?" one of the Gen Ed students asked as the hall started to filter empty again. Monoma groaned, turning on his heel back to where he was supposed to have been going in the first place. As he passed the classroom door, Shadow caught sight of him and meowed loudly. Bakugo turned to him, locking glares, and slowly tilted his shoulder so that Shadow could jump down. Monoma turned his glare off Bakugo and onto the cat. Its eyes blew out wide. Monoma sprinted down the hall. He stopped at the teacher's lounge door, taking a moment to breathe. A weight slammed into his side, and he hit the floor with a shout. He could hear Bakugo's barking laugh down the hall, and the purring of a cat as it kneaded the back of his uniform, settling down. There was no way that cat didn't have a quirk. Saturday was a surprisingly well-tempered day. The dorm was bustling with the class doing their own activities, most of them centered in the common room. Bakugo came down the stairs with a shopping list in hand. He walked briskly towards the door to put his shoes on. He waved the shopping list in the air. "If you want anything, put it on the list now or deal with it." Uraraka bounded over and snatched the list up, writing down a few items. She passed it around the room, some students passing it on without adding anything after doing a quick once-over. Once it hit Todoroki, he paused to read it. "Can you pick up the buckwheat flour instead of the soba noodles?" he asks. "I like yours better." "Of course you do," Bakugo said smugly. Write it down. Once the list had made its way back to him, he stuffed it in his back pocket. He slammed the door behind him. Yaoyorozu returned to trying to play with Shadow, only to be ignored as she stared at the door. Asui, who had a feather toy in her hand, tilted her head at Shadow. The cat got up from her position on the floor and bounded over to the door with a sad meow. Hagakure, who had been getting herself a snack, stumbled in the kitchen entryway, clutching at her chest based on the wrinkles that appeared. "Oh God, no," she pleaded. "Shadow, baby, no." Shadow gave another sad meow, pawing at the door. "Oh my God," Kaminari laughed. "She misses him." "He is her dad," Ashido shouted. She whipped out her phone, pulling up Bakugo's number. "I have to tell him." Shadow stopped pawing at the door. She stared up at it, at the handle specifically, and then waltzed to the staircase. The class watched as she stopped at the base of the stairs and turned around. Ida tapped Aizawa's shoulder at the dining tables and nodded towards the cat. Aizawa glanced up, seeing the gears turn in Shadow's head, the look all too familiar. Shadow then sprinted towards the front door. She jumped up, rebounding off the wall, and landed her paws on the latch handle of the door. Her weight pushed it down, the door swinging free with what momentum was left, and Shadow landed back onto the floor. She turned, holding the door open with her paw, and slipped out. Ashido was left gaping, alongside half the class, as Shadow's paw came back into view, and the door was slowly pulled shut. The weight of the door had it halfway back into the latch. They could hear scratching, and then the door was pulled shut entirely. "What the fuck?" Ashido muttered. "Are we sure that Shadow doesn't have an intelligence quirk?" Ida asks. "No," Aizawa drawls, returning to the papers before him. At least he knew how Shadow had been getting out now. "That's just a cat." "Pretty sure that's not the average cat," Shinsu says. "Do you think we can get Majima-sensei and Ishiyama-sensei to make a cat door for her?" Midoriya asks the room at large. All eyes turned towards Aizawa after a moment. He sighed, bowing his head. He wasn't going to avoid their constant begging if he didn't text the two men now. He pulled his phone out. "If only to keep her from possibly damaging the doorknob," he says. "Oh, Momo, can you make her a cute collar that we can use to open it?" Uraraka asks. "Like those automatic doors. Don't those come with a collar specifically aligned to that door?" Asui asks. Uraraka deflated over the back of the couch. "Oh, probably. I can make her a cute collar that we can switch it out for," Yaoyorozu offers. "I love you," Uraraka says immediately, her head whipping up to smile proudly at her. Yaoyorozu blushed instantly, trying to hide her face. "Oh, Ochako." Aizawa sighed, forcing himself to remain looking at his paperwork. The door suddenly slammed open. Most of the class turned to look at Bakugo, who stormed inside with Shadow in his arms, and dumped her onto the couch, right in Kirishima's lap. Shadow turned to him, meowing pitifully, and almost sassily. "Stay," Bakugo ordered. Another long meow. "You can't go in the fucking store, just stay." "Bakugo, I don't think she understands." "Shut the hell up, Sparky, she understands damn fine," Bakugo snapped. He snapped his fingers, pointing at Shadow accusingly. "Stay." Shadow stared at him a moment. The room was silent as they watched Bakugo glare her down. Eventually, Shadow sat down in Kirishima's lap, flicking her tail in annoyance. Bakugo nodded once, turning on his heel. "Don't let her out again, you fucking extras." He slammed the door shut behind him. Uraraka was last to turn away from the door. She cleared her throat, rubbing the back of her head. "So, who's going to tell him about the cat door idea?" "Midoriya." The class all said at large. Midoriya himself spit out his drink. Bakugo watched Shadow as she sized up her cat tree. The cat door on the front door of the dorm had been synced to her collar, which the girls had replaced with a rather decorative floral patterned collar, so she'd been getting outside more and more as the weather improved. As the weeks progressed, however, she'd gotten larger. At first, he hadn't really picked up on it. But as the days progressed into weeks, she was growing at a steady pace. She finally climbed the cat tree, but only to the first level, settling down on the baseboard to groom. Bakugo stormed over, picking her up. She gave a protesting mewl, but didn't fight him. He held her out to the class at large. "All right," he shouted angrily. The class turned to him. He was intent on shouting again, but most of his anger disappeared when Shadow gave a rather comical murp of a meow. No one's been feeding her again, so who the fuck is taking her to the vet? Todoroki wasted no time in slamming his father's card down on the table yet again, beating Yayurazu to the punch by seconds. She sent him a pouting glare. Bakugo swiped the card off the table with a barely perceptible whip and sauntered towards the door. "Only 3 of you assholes can join me," he says. Ashido sprinted towards the door. Todoroki followed after her. Bakugo raised a brow at him. "I know why this one is coming," he says, jerking his thumb towards Ashido. "I'm paying." "Fair enough." "See, can I come?" Midoriya asks. "Yeah, come on, nerd," Bakugo mumbles. He hefted Shadow onto his shoulders. She rode his shoulders the entire walk to the vet's office. Once they entered the, thankfully empty, waiting room, the receptionist looked up and smiled, standing. "Oh, look at how big she's gotten," she cooed. "You remember her?" Todoroki asks. Shadow was pawing at his hair playfully. "I remember you boys," the receptionist admitted. "And then I remembered how tiny she was when you brought her in the first time." "You are. Oh, you're the boy who went up against Shadow in the sports festival." "Ah, yes, hello," Midoriya said with a bow. The second receptionist finally looked up from her computer screen, her eyes zeroing in on Shadow's placement. She snorted, covering her mouth. "Oh my god. What can we do for you today?" the first asks. "Just a checkup on this little cutie," Ashido says with a smile, twirling her finger around Shadow's tail. "Sure thing. It's slow today, so we can get you in soon, I think," she says. Bakugo slinks away, letting Todoroki and Midoriya handle the check-in. Ashido followed him, giggling as Shadow started to paw at her horns once they sat down. "Name change?" "Oh, yeah," Midoriya grabbed a pen, filling out a form as Todoroki handed over the credit card. Bakugo glanced in Ashido's direction when her giggling started to turn to gentle snorting. She was bowing her head so that Shadow could paw and sniff her horns, ruffling her hair. Once Midoriya and Todoroki had joined them, Shadow had stretched across Bakugo and Ashido's shoulders, her hind legs bracing her on Bakugo's shoulder, whilst her front paws were on Ashido. It wasn't long before they were called back, and all 4 of them filed into the exam room. The vet came in shortly after the technician took Shadow's vitals and weight. After over 20 minutes of the vet and tech speaking in shorthand, Bakugo finally snapped. "The fuck is wrong with her?" he asks. The vet turned to them. "Oh, no. She's fine. She's just that big," the vet says. They scratch Shadow's chin, eliciting a purr. "She's not 6 months old yet, so she's probably going to get larger." "Larger?" Midoriya asks. Todoroki glanced at Shadow, who was already almost 9 pounds. Still rather small, but disproportionate and lanky given how fast she was growing. "Well, we have no record of who her parents are, so we don't really know what breeds they are. Without a test, it's hard to tell what genes specifically are in her lineage. By the time she's 6 months, however, she'll be full grown. Most cats are by then," the vet explains. "Looks like a Persian Longhair was definitely the dominant breed, though." "And the other one?" Bakugo asks, eyeing Shadow. She rolled onto her side once she noticed his gaze. "Well, if it was a smaller breed, she'll likely bottom out at about 10 or 12 pounds, the vet says. If it was a larger breed, could be upwards of 14. I've seen cats come in that were 20 pounds and healthy." "20?" Midoriya asks. "That's not as common. the vet says with a laugh. Just bring her back in at 6 months for a checkup, and I can let you know if she's overweight then. Bakugo side-eyed Shadow. She looked up at him, rolling over again, with a soft mew. You better fucking not, he whispered. Shadow mewed again, reaching a paw out. So, what you're saying is that she's going to be a chonker, Ashido says. Bakugo turned on his heel. Hell no. She's a chonker, Ashido cheered. Potentially, the vet corrected. We're not calling her that. A unit. I will fucking kill you. K. Kakin, please. Stop me, nerd. If we paid up front, can we leave immediately? Todoroki asks, ignoring the three others. The vet gave him a sheepish smile and nod. Once they were on their way back to the dorm, Shadow perched atop Ashido's shoulders and head. Looking around curiously, Ashido turned to Bakugo. So, we're going to have to get her a bigger cat tree for her to jump up, right? Or put counterweights on the one she has, Todoroki says. She'll get too big to use it regardless. Shoo, Midoriya says sheepishly. Oh. Momo is buying that shit, Bakugo declares. Todoroki immediately turned to him. You two bozos are taking turns. Fine. Do we have to call the kitty corner the cat corner now? Ashido asks. Why the fuck would I care? Bakugo asks. Well, she's your baby. Do you want to die? Admit it and accept it, Ashido shouted. She moved Shadow to cradle in her arms and started sprinting for the dorms, cackling. Get back here, Pinky. Midoriya smiled, watching them. She's a good therapy cat, honestly, he says. Todoroki nodded. Bakugo is much calmer. I meant the whole dorm. But yeah, he is better than before, Midoriya mused, nodding. Shadow had come in and out of the 6-month visit with flying colors. Bakugo had expected nothing less. Todoroki and Yaoyorozu had both slammed their cards on the table when it came to paying, holding a staring contest for a sweet few minutes, until Bakugo had shoved them both aside to slam his card down instead. Ashido came down the stairs, still giggling from Yaoyorozu recounting the tale in the girls' communal bathroom, only to see Shadow's fur at the cat tree. She sauntered over, spying Kuda's rabbit curled up against Shadow's side in the small, walled bedding area. Her knees buckled instantly, and she face planted into the carpet. It was so unfair, but so worth the pain of her nose on the floor as she tried to imprint the image into her memory. She just had to leave her phone upstairs, hadn't she? Midoriya came down moments later, spying her on the floor. He gave a very strangled, concerned and confused noise, and then looked up to the cat tree. He joined her shortly thereafter. Ashido made a questioning grunt. Midoriya answered with a pitiful whine. Ashido reached out a hand and patted his back in camaraderie. Kuda looked at them both from his spot on the sofa. He sipped his tea, nodding. He'd had his death by cuteness moment earlier, when he'd brought the rabbit down that morning. Shadow had hopped down from the cat tree and snaked his legs, eager to inspect the new thing in his arms. He'd knelt and explained to Shadow that this was, in fact, not food, but a friend. From there, Shadow had carried the rabbit up to the top of the cat tree and immediately gone into cuddle mode. It was less than 30 minutes later that Bakugo had come down from his room to find the two on the floor and Kuda finishing off his tea. He stared at the two, unwavering, before looking up at Kuda and signing. What am I looking at here? Look at the cat tree. Bakugo glanced up. Shadow looked up, squeaked, and then lowered their head back onto the rabbit's back. He was staring between Shadow, Ashido, and Midoriya. Kuda fiddled with his mug, unsure if Bakugo was able to process the sight before him. Finally, Bakugo turned to him and signed rapidly. This bitch didn't wait for me to blink back. What? Kuda gaped at him. Bakugo huffed, stomping off to the kitchen. Ashido lifted her head. Bakubro, she called. She glanced at Kuda. He's in the kitchen. How did he not collapse? Ashido asks, laying her head back down. Determination, Midoriya says. his voice muffled into the carpet. Midoriya had Shadow on his lap, curled up and purring. Uraraka was cooing at her, scratching under her chin. Ida was running the brush over Shadow. The hair pile had reached the size of a small mouse at this point when pressed into a ball. Yaoyorozu was sitting near the kitty corner, making toy after toy, with Jiru and Hagakure and Asui handing over snacks when she gestured for more, looking over her phone intently for toy designs. They'd donated so many toys to the local shelters at this point that she was fairly certain the receptionist was recognizing them. Oddly enough, Shadow had taken the most liking to a ball that was an early attempt. It had a strange and uneven texture that Yaoyorozu had considered a failure until Shadow had adamantly started batting it around with vigor. Presently, Shadow had tired herself out with play and was enjoying being lavishly pampered. Uraraka was gushing over Shadow's head resting in her palm as she scratched her cheek. Shadow stretched out, her purr resonating louder for a moment. Her ear flicked when she heard familiar feet coming down the stairs. She looked up at Bakugo as he entered the common room. He glanced up at the group surrounding her. Shadow mewed, slowly closing her eyes. Bakugo held his gaze on her for a moment. "Kaken?" Midoriya asks. Bakugo sauntered up. He quickly glanced around at the room at large, spotting none of the Baka squad in sight. "Not a fucking word," he says, whipping out his phone and taking a few pictures. Uraraka gaped at him. "Did you just—" "Not a word, pink cheeks, or I'll blow up your desk," Bakugo says, reaching up to scratch Shadow behind her ear. Which desk?" Uraraka asks. "It'll be a surprise," Bakugo says, turning towards the kitchen. "I don't want that surprise," Uraraka mumbles, deflating. Shadow shook them all off, shaking herself out and trotting to the kitchen. She paused in the doorway, tail swishing, as she watched Bakugo and others trot around the kitchen. Movement on the fridge caught her eye. Takoyami was perched on the top of the fridge, eating an apple. Shadow stared for a long moment before she trotted to the counter. She launched herself onto the counter and then onto the top of the fridge, barely clearing the height. Takoyami whipped his head around at her. Dark Shadow did the same, peering from Takoyami's other side. Shadow mewed at them, rubbing at Takoyami's back, before crouching beside him. Bakugo had glanced up once Shadow had hopped onto the counter. He had watched her climb to the fridge top and then perch. He wordlessly held his phone up, snapping another photo. His mother was never going to let him hear the end of this. But she also would have never let him hear the end of it if he didn't take and send a photo or two. Or 30. It was one of those nights in the dorms where everyone was mentally too exhausted for homework. Even as the textbooks had been pulled out, once the immediately pressing homework had been done, that was it. Everyone had tapped out in favor of casual hangouts, video sharing, and light conversation. Bakugo came down from his room, having retreated to get more work done than he knew he would staying downstairs, with scowl already in place. Ashido glanced up and winked, shifting her legs off the couch to open up a seat for him. She held out her arm, beckoning him over. Bakugo glanced away from her for a moment, though, towards the kitty corner, clocking Shadow immediately. She was resting on her cat bed at the top of her cat tree. Her girth was starting to fill it out entirely. She looked up at him once he'd hit the main floor. Shadow chirped, a little sassily, slowly blinking at him. Bakugo paused. Ashido flicked her gaze between him and Shadow. Bakubabe? Ashido asks. A few other occupants looked up themselves. Shiro paused the video he'd been showing Shoji and Ajiro. Bakugo threw his phone onto the couch. Ashido scrambled to catch it. He stomped over to the cat tree. "Oh, Kami, he's lost it," Shiro says, already trying to detangle himself from the blanket. Perhaps he'd finally lost himself in his asinine studying habits and was going to fistfight the first thing that had looked at him funny. Lord help that it was Shadow, the cat that used Kirishima as a scratching post. Sadu still had scars on his arm from when he tried to play with her without the glove. This cat had the reflexes of their sensei and claws to match. Zero wasn't entirely certain. None of them were. If Bakugo would actually win any kind of conflict with Shadow. Frankly, none of them would win, really. Instead, Zero was face planting into the carpet as he watched Bakugo halt at the cat tree. He was petting Shadow. Petting her. Openly and gently. Just right there. His movements were awkward at first, as if he were still so incredibly anxious about accidentally activating his quirk with Shadow right there at his palms. Midoriya was watching from the kitchen, his head tilting, and already looking like he had to grab his notebook. And then Bakugo's shoulders relaxed, actually sagging a little, as he got more comfortable with stroking Shadow's cheek. Ashido could hear the purr all the way from the couch. Shadow shifted in the cat tree, wriggling around until her belly was up, and she was letting him pet her stomach. Kirishima almost dropped his phone. Ashido stood on the arm of the couch, bringing up her camera to record. Finally, she whispers. Bakugo shot her a quick glare. Ashido snickered, pausing the recording. You can't blame me, babe. You've only let her climb you or lay in your lap. I wake up to her, Bakugo says. More to mess with them and brag, really. Todoroki freezing a portion of the table made it entirely worth it to admit. Yaoyorozu patted his shoulder, and he started to melt it sheepishly. Pics or it doesn't happen, Kaminari shouted. Bakugo resolutely ignored them all, turning his attention back to Shadow. This was surprisingly relaxing, if he were to be quite honest. She was starting to rest her paws around his forearm and hand to the point. It looked like she was hugging him. Ow, Ashido cooed, slipping back onto the couch. Hey, I'm serious, Kaminari was shouting. Pics or I call bullshit. Bakugo scoffed. He wasn't going to relinquish those so easily. He just had to ensure that none of his classmates caught sight of the sheer number of pictures he'd taken on his phone. For someone who was constantly claiming that this cat was not his cat, he had a damning number on there. Some of the cat photos were candid shots of the class playing with, pampering, or cuddling Shadow. Some were in the realm of a selfie with Bakugo holding the phone up high to get both he and Shadow in the shot when she joined him in his bed. She'd always snuggle up to his side or his shoulder or arm and fall right to sleep. She had made him late to his morning runs more than once. Sometimes she'd lay on him, and he struggled to get any good photos of those moments. Too much movement, and she'd wake up and slide off. He'd managed to somewhat train her not to turn his arms into a bloody mess in the process of those morning pamperings. Thankfully, since he'd started that, there hadn't been a repeat incident like Satu's arm. She had figured out that Kirishima was really the only one she could use as a human scratch post. Bakugo gave her one last scratch behind the ears before turning away. Shadow trilled after him, getting comfortable again in her bed. Bakugo snatched his phone up from the couch, taking up half the couch as he lounged out onto it. Ashido laid over him, holding her phone up to show him the video of him pampering Shadow. Delete that. I already shared it to the group chat. He opened up the chat, and lo and behold, it was there, and already been viewed by most of the class. You ass. You're such a softie, Ashido coos.